The responses to petition.
I, I'll ask again, all those opposed to the honourable member moving the motion will please say nay. Will please say nay. And we do not have unanimous consent. Présentation de rapport Présentation de rapport de comité. The honourable member from Humber River Black Creek.
I have the honour to present in both official languages the 21st report of the Standing Committee on International Labour, referring to Canadian supply chains and the issue of forced labour. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member, l'honorable député de Vaudreuil-Soulanges.
The honourable member for Vaudreuil-Soulanges. Mr. Speaker, I have the honour to present in both official languages the 19th report of the Standing Committee on Transport, Infrastructure and Communities, entitled the Erie Lake Connector, a project in the best interest of the public. Pursuant to Standing Order 109, the committee asked the government to table an overall response to the report.
Dépôt de projet.
Introduction of private members' bills.
Première lecture de projet de loi d'intérêt.
First reading of Senate public bills. Motions. Mr. Boulris, seconded by Mr. Julian, moves that the 12th report of the Standing Committee on Human Resources, Skills and Social Development and the Status of Persons with Disabilities, tabled on October 6, 2023, be concurred in. Debate. The honourable member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I'd like to say that I will be sharing my time with the member for Port Moody Coquitlam.
Excellent choix, je pense aussi.
And I think that's a very good choice. I am very pleased to rise in this House to speak of a matter that is of great interest to Canadians and Quebecers: the housing crisis. This is a crisis throughout the country. It will have very serious effects. This is a fundamental right, the right to house yourself and to have a roof over your head. For several years, with my team in Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie, we've had a tradition, which is every year to rent out Beaubien Cinema and to get the rights for a documentary screening and to invite people to come watch the documentary for free. And it also gives people to have a chance to speak with the artist who created the documentary. So this year, we had an opportunity to watch a very interesting documentary, The Last Flip, which is a documentary about the great importance of the definancialization of real estate. The documentary makers, Ms. Bérard and Mr. Vachon, were in the room, and we were able to speak with them. There were also representatives of various housing organizations in the region, in the neighborhood, rather. We saw that people were very interested in this. 2 entire rooms were filled. 500 people came to watch the documentary. And they also wanted to talk about solutions, because we've seen over the last few decades that there has been a real drift towards speculation, and the fact that investment funds and trusts are increasingly involved in buying and building housing. And this ends up leading to an increase in prices. It hurts people. There are various models for solutions. We should look at what happened with Bernie Sanders in Burlington in the 80s. We know that Bernie Sanders is a socialist senator in the States, but prior to that, he was mayor of Burlington. And at that time, he created what is called a community land trust. It's a type of investment tool. And so the way it works is that a family that wants to buy a home and the community land trust become co-owners, co-investors. And so the person becomes co-owner, the family becomes a co-owner, and later, when the sale happens, well, the revenues of the sale are shared between the land trust and the family. And so people were able to make more advantageous purchases of homes based on that. And then at the end, the land trust ends up getting some of the revenue back, which means that it can later move forward and help someone else to buy a house. It can help families, students. That's how the mechanism works. We had some very interesting discussions about this alternative method that makes it easier to access a home, to access property. And today, this Champlain House property in Burlington has many housing units available, and it's enabled to keep the real estate market there much more under control and have much more affordable prices and accessible for people. So that's one model, but there are many others. For example, housing co-ops, which enable people to access apartments in a more affordable way. And once again, there are controls here. There are checks on the increase in the price of rent. So for people who may not be able to afford, say, a condo on the free market or a home on the free market, but when they access housing co-ops and their services, well, it's a good place for them to live, but also it leads to a sense of community because people can work together, find solutions together, and they can decide how they want to repair and renovate their home. And these are all part of what we call non-market solutions, because there's just a different way of thinking about housing. And another possible solution is to use public lands to create truly affordable housing. And when I speak about affordable housing, I want to be very clear. Affordable means that we look at what the person is actually able to pay. We don't want to look at, say, an arbitrary level like 80% of the median price. No. We need to look at what's actually affordable. For example, at one point, a 2-bedroom in Montreal was considered affordable if it was at $2,200 a month. That's ridiculous. People who don't earn a high income, well, they're just not able to afford that. So the use of public lands to build truly affordable housing should be a priority. And that's a tool that works very well. Unlike the Conservatives, who want to sell public lands to private developers who will end up building housing with their only goal being to make as much in profit as they can as quickly as possible. It's the worst possible solution. It's the worst idea, and yet that's what the Conservatives are bringing forward. They have tunnel vision. They can only imagine this capitalist market-based system. They just want to maximize investor profits. There are many alternatives, like the community trust that I spoke about in Burlington, or an acquisition fund. So, as I said, we can use public lands, but we could also have taxpayer money set aside, a fund that would enable the government to buy homes, duplexes, triplexes, and so on. And that way, very democratically, we would be able to control prices and rents. Imagine, Mr. Speaker, Vienna in Austria has had this system, and so the government of Vienna buys up anything it can whenever an apartment or a house becomes available. It buys it up. And so today, 60% of real estate in Vienna belongs to the municipality. And guess what? There's not the type of speculation we've seen here in Canada for decades, that we've seen because of the bad decisions made by the Liberals and Conservatives. So this documentary that I was talking about, Le Dernier Flip, said that we should have a target of 20% of housing units being non-market. Not 100%. Of course, we'll have a private sector There'll be a private real estate sector, just as there is now, and that's fine. But currently the level is far too low. It's only 3%. We should set a target of 20%, because 20% would enable us to stabilize the market, and it would have a beneficial effect on the private market too, because it would slow down the fires of speculation. I see that I have barely any time left, so I would just like to add that there is a research group in Montreal called l'IRIS. It published a study in June 2024. We have a housing crisis where there are many people who are suffering. And so this IRIS report is called the winners of the housing crisis, because there are also winners. The real winners here are investment firms, funds, trusts, who end up with tax benefits and all sorts of things, and who are only there to try to make profits. 30 years ago, they made up barely any of our real estate market, and it's gone up from being essentially nothing to 20%. 20% of all of our housing stock in Canada. And this is all in the hands of people who only want to make money as quickly as possible. And it's this financialization of the real estate market, the housing stock. This IRIS report, among other things, this report has shown us that it's harming people, it's harming renters. There's just not enough affordable non-market housing. We need to look into that as quickly as possible. We need to use public money in a judicious manner, rethink how we envision investing in housing, and remind everyone that we all have a right to a roof over our heads.
And comments? The honourable member for Calgary Midnapore.
Senor Presidente, today I rise to present petition E5102.
So yeah, no, we're not in, because we're not into petitions right now, so, okay, very good. The Honourable Deputy House Leader.
Question? So my question for the member, as we talk about housing and affordable housing, is that we've heard the Conservatives be extremely critical of the Housing Accelerator Fund, but yet it was revealed today in a CBC story, or it was one of the outlets revealed, that 5 Conservative members had written to the Housing Minister encouraging the Housing Minister to award Housing Accelerator money to their ridings so that their communities could benefit from them. I'm wondering if the member would like to provide his thoughts on the hypocrisy between what Conservatives are saying and what they're doing behind the back of their leader.
The Honourable Member for Rougemont-la-Petite-Patrie. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, indeed. I saw that in the news, and I pretty much fell out of my chair because it's such a flagrant contradiction. My colleague talked about hypocrisy, and that's exactly what it is, because what the Conservative colleagues want to do is cut everywhere they can, especially in this program that works. And so it works so well that the municipal projects, they want them to be accepted, but the leader doesn't want this, so they should probably discuss among themselves. Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Joliette. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to commend my colleague on his excellent speech. It's a very good overview. I want to talk about the problem of financialization of housing. According to him, has the government put in sufficient measures to tackle this? For example, what about the Claridge matter in Montreal? The Honourable Member for Rougemont-la-Petite-Patrie. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague. There are tax exemptions, there are loopholes with the capital gains tax, and that means that these major funds and trusts don't have paid their fair share of tax, and that incites them to build hundreds of housing units, and this hurts tenants. So what we're saying in the NTB is that if those funds cannot guarantee that they're going to maintain affordable housing, then we're going to tax them even more steeply. And the Canadian Association for Tax Fairness did an excellent study on the fact that we need to review these measures because the Liberals haven't had the courage to tackle this yet, but I hope they certainly will soon. The honourable member for New Westminster Burnaby. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague from Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie for his excellent speech and for the fact that every single day he raises the matter of affordable housing and how much it is lacking in Montreal, Quebec, and across Canada. So I know that the Liberals have given a great deal of CMHC funding to multinationals and major companies, for example. So the Conservatives plan to do the same thing rather than helping people with social and affordable housing and housing cooperatives. I'd like my colleague to explain to us, because he's an excellent advocate for social housing, what do we need to change so that we can help middle-class families instead of paying money to people who are already rich? The honourable member. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for his question. I didn't have time to say in my speech how much of a middle-class housing budget is eaten up by housing. For example, there are many people who pay more than 30% of their budget in rent or in mortgage, and that we're talking about millions of people in Canada. So what we need to do is set aside the sums in the Affordable Housing Fund for the nonprofit sector. So let's use the nonprofit sector to build a truly affordable housing, but to do that, we need to review the Liberal housing strategy, which has not been productive in past years.
Commissioner Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to start by saying thank you to the member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie for bringing up this really important report on the financialization of housing. I'm sure he's as disappointed as I was that this government chose not to end the tax exemption for real estate investment trusts back in the spring. And even in this report, the recommendation is just to keep studying it. I wonder if you can comment on how, enough is enough. We don't need to study the tax exemptions we're giving to large corporate investors that are raising rents for folks in my community as well as his. We can actually use those funds to give it to groups like Habitat for Humanity that want to build more affordable housing. Can you comment on this?
The honourable member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie. Thank you. I'd like to thank my colleague for that question. Indeed, it's not as if we don't know what the solutions are. It's just that the Liberals are dragging their feet. There were cuts that have gone on for years and years, and we see that the development of social housing suffers too. We see that in 6 cities in Quebec in the past few years, there was only 2% and 5% in Trois-Rivières and Saguenay, respectively. That was the share of social housing that was completed. So we need to change this, Mr. Speaker. That's why we need social housing. Point of order, the honourable member. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There has been consultation among the parties, and I see that there is unanimous consent, so I can present a petition that I was supposed to present today. So I'm seeking that consent, that all those who oppose this, please say nay.
In terms of the motion, all those opposed to the motion, please say nay. Motion is carried.
The honourable member for Pierre Boucher des Patriotes Verchères. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in this House to officially table this petition, which is according to the standing orders. It was signed by 15 people, and it has been signed by a number of municipal councillors who are here on the Hill. This petition calls on the House of Commons to step in with the Government of Canada and the ministers so that they give the sums necessary for the wharf of Verchères. So we need to call on the Fisheries and Oceans, and nothing has been done. So the Verchères people are impatient. This wharf has deteriorated to the extent that it is the access is banned because it is not safe. So I'm calling on the government to respond to this very important issue for the people of Verschile. Thank you.
Okay, and if there's any other unanimous consent motions to come forward, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There has been discussions amongst the parties, and I expect if you were to ask it, you'd get the leave for me to be able to table the petitions and or the responses to the petitions and my questions for the order paper. If I could do that, I would appreciate it.
All those opposed to the Honourable Member moving the motion, please say nay. Agree. The House has heard the terms of the motion. All those opposed to the motion will please say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Under tabling of the motions pursuant to Standing Order 36.8a, I have the honour to table in both official languages the government's responses to 3 petitions. These returns will be tabled in electronic format. Under questions on the order paper, Mr. Speaker, the following questions will be answered today. 2905, 2907, 2909, 2910, 2914, 2916, 2918, 2919, 2925, 2929, 2931, 2932, 2934, and 2941. Furthermore, Mr. Speaker, if government's responses to questions number 2906, 2908, 2911 to 2913, 2915, 2917, 2920 to 2924, 2926 to 2928, 2933, 2935 to 2940, and 2942 to 2946 could be made orders for return. These returns would be tabled in an electronic format immediately.
Is it the pleasure of the House that the aforementioned questions be made orders for return and they be tabled immediately? Agreed and so ordered. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, I would then ask that all remaining questions be allowed to stand.
Thank the Honourable Member. I believe another point of order. The Honourable Member for Battle River Crowfoot.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I would ask for unanimous consent to be able to present petitions.
All those opposed to the Honourable Member moving the motion, please say nay. Agreed. The House has heard the terms of the motion. All those opposed to the motion will please say nay. Motion is carried. So we're back onto the, for a few moments on the rubric of petitions. The Honourable Member of Calgary, Mindapore.
Finalmente, Señor Presidente. Today, I rise to present petition E5012. 1,650 people signed this petition due to their concerns about the July 28th presidential election in Venezuela. They are calling on this government to recognize Edmundo González Urrutia as the rightful victor in the election, demand the Maduro regime release the full vote count and access to voting records at polling stations, impose sanctions on all individuals associated with the Maduro regime complicit with violating international law and the Venezuelan Constitution, and do everything in its power to support the people of Venezuela as they fight for freedom and real democracy in their country. Viva Venezuela Libre!
While we appreciate visitors to the galleries, we just ask everybody to. I know it's exciting. Presenting of petitions, and we'll do a quick round of presenting of petitions. The Honourable Member of Battle River Crowfoot.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and it is my honour to stand in this place today and present a petition that requests that the Canadian Parliament and government to pass a resolution to establish measures to stop the Chinese Communist regime's crime of systematically murdering Falun Gong practitioners for their organs, and B, amend Canadian legislation to combat forced organ harvesting, and C, publicly call for an end to the persecution of Falun Gong in Canada. And just in particular, Mr. Speaker, referencing Min Young Lu and the many Falun Gong who have faced persecution, and the importance of ensuring that their freedoms are respected, and as Canadians, the responsibility we have to do something about it.
Presenting of petitions, présentation de pétition, the Honourable Member for Edmonton-Griesbach.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to present and table in both official languages a petition on behalf of Canadians that are calling on the government to address the housing crisis. It goes on so far as to state that we, the undersigned citizens of the residents of Canada, call on the Government of Canada to 1. Impose a moratorium on rent evictions and other forms of displacing tenants in pursuit of higher profits. 2. Invest in affordable housing operated by non-profit housing providers to ensure there are affordable housing units available for our most vulnerable And finally, 3, stop providing billions of dollars in handouts to corporate landlords who are buying up the existing affordable housing, evicting people, and raising rents. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Presenting petitions, the Honourable Member for Yorkton Melville.
Thank you, Chair. Speaker, I want to draw attention of the House of Commons to the following. Falun Gong is a traditional Chinese spiritual discipline whose moral teachings are truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance. The Chinese government perceives religion as a threat to its state atheism, especially Falun Gong, whose popularity has grown since it was founded in 1992. Since 1999, the Chinese government has persecuted Falun Gong practitioners in the thousands, perhaps even millions. Zhang Yonghe is the sister of Tian Xiaozhong, a Canadian citizen from Toronto. She was arrested in 2002 in Qingdao City and was detained for over half a year because she was a practitioner of Falun Gong. Her family was not notified of her arrest, making this a case of forced disappearance. Her family's called on the Shandong Province Prison Administration many times to inquire about Yunhe, and the prison administration remains silent on this matter, a clear dereliction of duty. Zhang Yunhe has not been seen, and there have been no reports on her since her arrest. Therefore, these individuals, the undersigned, request the Canadian Parliament and Government to pass a resolution to establish measures to stop the Chinese Communist regime's crime of systematically imprisoning Falun Gong practitioners, amend Canadian legislation to combat forced organ harvesting, and finally, publicly call for an end to the persecution of Falun Gong in China.
Petitions, the Honourable Member for Langley Aldergrove.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to present a petition signed by Canadians who are deeply concerned that the Chinese Communist Party has launched an intensive nationwide persecution campaign against practitioners of Falun Gong, including a Ms. Alice Zhang. They're concerned that many of these Falun Gong prisoners have died and their organs have been harvested, and they're calling on the Canadian government to pass a resolution to establish measures to stop the Chinese Communist regimes of systematically murdering Falun Gong practitioners, to amend Canadian legislation to that effect, and to publicly call for an end to the persecution of Falun Gong members. Thank you.
Presenting petitions, the Honourable Member for New Westminster Burnaby.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to present a petition on behalf of 26 constituents in British Columbia for a petition that was sponsored by the fantastic, hardworking member from Port Moody, Coquitlam. Basically, the petition and the petitioners are calling upon the Government of Canada to impose a moratorium on renovictions and other forms of displacing tenants in pursuit of higher profits, to invest in affordable housing operated by non-profit housing providers to ensure that there is affordable housing units available for our most vulnerable, and to stop providing billions of dollars in handouts to corporate landlords who are buying up the existing affordable housing, evicting people, and raising rents. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Presenting petitions, the Honourable Member for Oxford.
Residents of Oxford County who are stating that after 9 years of this Liberal government, homelessness is a growing crisis in communities right across our country. We are seeing over 1,400 homeless encampments in our province of Ontario alone. They are particularly speaking about the encampments that have become a visible and urgent issue, highlighting the lack of affordable housing and inadequate support services for those experiencing homelessness, and the impact that it has on small and rural counties and communities like mine. They're particularly speaking about making sure we have enough support to get them the help they need, but also to make sure that the residents that live in these communities have safe, viable neighborhoods to raise their families and walk around in their parks. So they're calling on the Government of Canada to work with all levels of government to find a solution to end homelessness and take care of this homelessness encampment crisis that we're seeing right across our country by providing support to those who need the help the most. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Presenting petitions, the Honourable Member for London Fanshawe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I too would like to stand to present a petition that was sponsored by the fantastic MP for Port Moody, Coquitlam. These citizens have asked again for a moratorium on renovictions because they're seeing more and more of their community housing, affordable housing units being taken away by corporate landlords solely for profit. They wish that the House of Commons and the government would invest more in affordable housing, operated not-for-profit housing units, and to provide for our most vulnerable. And I'm excited to present this petition on their behalf. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Presenting petitions, présentation pétition, the honourable member for Brantford-Brant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Pleased to rise today and speak to a petition from several Canadians in support of the Falun Gong, and in particular Yao Feng Yun. Falun Gong is a traditional Chinese spiritual discipline which consists of meditation, exercise, and moral teachings based on the principles of truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance. A study was done, an investigation was done in 2006, and concluded that the Chinese regime and its agencies throughout China have put to death a large number and tens of thousands of Falun Gong prisoners of conscience. Their vital organs were seized involuntarily for sale at a high price. Therefore, the undersigned request the Canadian Parliament and government to A, pass a resolution to establish measures to stop the Chinese Communist regime's crime of systematically murdering Falun Gong practitioners for their organs. B, amend Canadian legislation to combat forced organ harvesting. And C, publicly call for an end to the persecution of Falun Gong in China. Thank you.
Presenting petitions, présentation pétition, the honourable for Lanark, Frontenac, Kingston.
Speaker, I too am rising on the to present a petition regarding Falun Gong and to deal with the organ harvesting issue. Mr. Speaker, I was the chair of the parliamentary committee that heard compelling testimony about this heinous practice. We call, of course, the petitioners call for Canada to adopt legislation to stop forced organ harvesting and publicly call for the end to the persecution of Falun Gong, a peaceful movement that embodies the best of Chinese cultural practices. I wanted, as in conclusion, to point out that Con Lang Yang, a Falun Gong practitioner with family ties to Canada, is one of those imprisoned. We also would call for their release. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Presenting petitions, présentation pétition, the honourable for Cypress Hills Grasslands. And then I'll go there.
Mr. Speaker, I actually have two petitions to do here today. The first one is in regards to Falun Gong practitioners who have been persecuted in China since 1999 by the CCP, who launched a campaign to have the faith eradicated in China. Li Yongmai is the mother of Su Ting Li, a resident from Calgary. Li Yongmai received her second prison sentence in 2023 for 5 years because she is a practitioner of Falun Gong. Her phone was being monitored for 6 months and her home was ransacked by police. She was strung up by her wrists with her feet in the air during the interrogation. She was first arrested in 2014 and was incarcerated from 2015 to 2017, where she was subjected to torture. She refused to renounce her faith or to admit any guilt, and as such she endured extended periods of squatting and standing, had freezing cold water poured on her. She was deprived of food and sleep. She was forced to do unpaid labor, was made to sleep on a bare bedboard with no blankets. Therefore, petitioners request the Canadian Parliament and government to A, pass a resolution to establish measures to stop the Chinese Communist regime's crime of systematically imprisoning Falun Gong practitioners, B, amend Canadian legislations to combat forced organ harvesting, and C, publicly call for an end to the persecution of Falun Gong in China. Mr. Speaker, the second petition that I have here today is in regards to our border. There is many citizens from Cypress Hills Grasslands who have written to me to express concerns about potential border closures and reduction of services. They note that the border crossing is important to the economic activity, but also as a front line to the safety and security of Canadians. And therefore, they want to make sure that they are consulted by the government before any changes of any kind would happen at our border crossings and with CBSA. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Petitions, the honourable report Moody Coquitlam.
Mr. Speaker, and the residents of Port Moody Coquitlam are very, very concerned about the price of housing. More and more people getting displaced out of their homes, getting rent-evicted. Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to say that the City of Port Moody recently passed a bylaw about standards of maintenance on rental housing just to keep people in safe housing, so I raise my hands to them. And those same folks, the residents of Port Moody Coquitlam, want to present a petition to this House. And they say, the undersigned citizens and residents of Canada call upon the Government of Canada to 1, impose a moratorium on rent evictions and other forms of displacing tenants in pursuit of higher profits, Number 2, invest in affordable housing, operated by nonprofit housing providers to ensure there are affordable housing units available for the most vulnerable. And number 3, stop providing billions of dollars in handouts to corporate landlords who are buying up the existing affordable housing, evicting people, and raising rents.
Petitions, the Honourable Pitt Meadows, Maple Ridge.
Mr. Speaker, I want to draw the attention of the House of Commons to the following. Since the CCP rule of China, they have implemented state atheism and perceived religion and believers as a threat to their rule. This is why in 1999, the CCP initiated a campaign of persecution against perhaps millions of Falun Gong practitioners due to its growing popularity in the country. Falun Gong is a Chinese spiritual discipline whose moral teachings are of tolerance, compassion, truthfulness, with millions of adherents all around the globe. Liu Xiaobo is the father of Jack Liu, a resident from Ottawa. Liu Xiaobo was unlawfully imprisoned from 2001 to 2009 for clarifying the truth regarding Falun Gong. Then in 2021, he was kidnapped from his home in Langford City. He was detained for 2 years in Beijing No. 3 Detention Center and a person of religious persecution and a prisoner of conscience. Mr. Speaker, the other members have said different comments on this right here, but I've talked to practitioners who've been in prison. It's a very serious situation, and this is an important petition. Thank you.
Petitions, the Honourable Mission Mascui, Fraser Canyon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A few years ago, I sat beside a new veteran on a flight to Ottawa. During the flight, she shared with me both the rewards and challenges of being a member of the Royal Canadian Navy. I had an opportunity to reconnect with this brave veteran a few weeks ago, and I was upset to hear she's still working to obtain the services she is entitled to. As we approach Remembrance Day, it's timely for me to rise today and bring this petition forward. Our veterans deserve better. They provided service to our country.
They should at least receive the benefits they are entitled to. Therefore, the petitioners call on the Minister of Veterans Affairs and National Defence to dramatically cut red tape, simplify and expedite the delivery of services and benefits for our military veterans, especially during their initial transition to civilian life.
The second petition I'd like to present today, Mr. Speaker, is on behalf of Falun Gong practitioners in Canada. They're calling for the Government of Canada to pass a resolution to establish measures to stop the Chinese communist regime of systematically imprisoning practitioners. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I wish to inform the House that the volume of earpieces will now be reset.
I wish to inform the House that the volume of earpieces will now be reset.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Port Moody Coquitlam.
I wanted to thank the member from Rosemont-La Petite Patrie.
Before I'm sorry, I skipped one. I know the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, Government House Leader has a motion he wanted to draw.
Yes.
And then
Mr. Speaker, there have been discussions amongst the parties, and if you seek it, I believe you'll find unanimous consent for the following motion, that notwithstanding any standing order, special order, or usual practice of the House, that during the debate pursuant to Standing Order 66 on the motion number 66 to concur in the 6th report of the Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy, and Ethics, no quorum calls, dilatory motions, or requests for unanimous consent shall be received by the Chair.
All those opposed to the Honourable Member moving the motion, please say nay. Motion is agreed. The House has heard the terms of the motion. All those opposed to the motion, please say nay. Motion is carried. And the Honourable Member for Port Moody Coquitlam can start right from the start.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So thanks to the member from Rosemont-La Petite Patrie for bringing forward this very important debate today and for showing how members from the NDP continue to work for Canadians while the Conservatives continue to debate themselves. The promise of the free market was the promise of opportunities for people. People were told that the market would bring competition, but that's not what it brought. What it has brought is corporate collusion. That has made life more expensive for everyday people, while corporate CEOs are taking home millions in bonuses. We've seen this collusion in the grocery industry and now in rental housing. The Liberals and the Conservatives put all of the housing eggs in the market basket. 40 years ago, they walked away from social housing, from purpose-built rental housing, from co-op housing. The market was supposed to build homes for people. It was supposed to create the stable rental housing that 30% of Canadians need. It has not. Instead, the market has reached peak greed, and now collusion in rental housing, leading to evictions, displacements, encampments, and a growing number of Canadians living rough. Even seniors and persons with disabilities cannot escape this free market and are not protected from corporate greed with these Liberals and Conservatives. Thanks to the NDP member from Vancouver East, the financialization of housing in Canada was brought to the forefront, including the study we're debating today from HUMA. The financialization of housing is the largest driver of housing unaffordability and homelessness in this country. Investors are turning homes for Canadians into financial assets that are pushing ordinary people out of the housing market and only profiting rich real estate CEOs. 1/3 of what should be stable and affordable rental housing for people has been purchased in recent years by private investors. In some cities, this problem gets even larger, with nearly half of all purpose-built rental being owned by wealthy investors. During committee, the committee heard from the federal housing advocate and leading researchers like Martine August how the financialization of housing is reshaping our communities and undermining the very fabric of our society as more and more people cannot afford a home. We are seeing this manifest in encampments across this country. Housing is increasingly being treated as a commodity and a financial asset rather than for what is the fundamental human right that it is. When housing becomes a vehicle for profit maximization for the few, it harms the majority. This Liberal government and the Conservatives before them stopped focusing on providing safe, secure, and affordable homes for Canadians. They have purposely laid the groundwork for the largest corporations and landlords to drive up their profit margins on the backs of Canadians. New Democrats have raised the alarm about this. There is endless proof that financialized landlords raise rents faster and higher than other landlords, and they file for more evictions than any other landlord type. This practice has become so prevalent that my NDP colleagues for Windsor West and Rosemont-Le Petit-Patrie have written to the Competition Bureau to investigate collusion on rent fixing. And landlords are now at the point that they're suing their tenants for libel when these tenants speak out on these unfair rental practices. Who's protecting those tenants from lawsuits? Not the Liberals or the Conservatives. It's only the New Democrats who are standing up for Canadians and not the wealthy CEOs who are taking away their homes. This is magnified when the Liberals and the Conservatives continue to team up in committee to protect corporate landlords by not agreeing to NDP motions to have these landlords come to committee to talk about their unfair tactics. Shame on the Liberals and the Conservatives for putting wealthy CEOs ahead of people and their homes. And the government led this financialization of housing, Mr. Speaker. They led their pension fund investments doing exactly the same thing. The Liberals are heavily involved in the financialization of housing. Whether it's through the CPP or the Public Service Pension Fund, Canadian pension plans are increasingly investing and buying up affordable housing, and then partnering with these corporate landlords like Starlight to extract maximum profits. An Access to Information request found that PSP Investments owns rental housing and has hired a corporate landlord to raise rents above guidelines, evict tenants, and kick them out on the street. The Liberal government is doing that. Tenants have been forced to organize rent strikes to fight back against these unfair practices. I wonder if the government will sue them as well, Mr. Speaker. Now, to make it even more unfair, the Liberal government has okayed the use of AI rental collusion software by their asset managers. The same algorithmic pricing tools that are part of an antitrust lawsuit in the U.S. for allegedly being used to price fix are now being used by the same asset managers the government has hired, firms that go after tenants. AI software like YieldStar and Yardi are working with the Canadian government through corporate landlords. AI in the marketplace is like all technology, a promise. When used correctly, it can make our lives easier, healthier, and better. But it can also be used by bad faith actors to crush competition and hurt renters. AI poses new challenges that make the potential scale of price fixing something we've never seen. As more and more industries use AI to optimize their prices, we are only going to see this problem more and more. This technology has the power to undermine the very foundation of fair competition in the rental market by simply creating an AI central planning that only serves the wealthy, and it's already happening. The Federal Housing Advocate told our committee about how the financialization of housing is a serious human rights issue that must be addressed. And now with the introduction of tools like AI, human rights are pushed even farther behind. It has the greatest potential to cause harm to Indigenous and disadvantaged groups such as vulnerable seniors, low-income tenants, people with disabilities, recent immigrants, refugees, and lone parent families. The financialization of housing does not have to be an inevitable fate. It is a choice of Liberals and Conservatives. The Liberals have the power to prioritize the well-being of people and ensure that every Canadian can find a place to call home. The report we're discussing today sheds light on the consequences of financialization. It points to alarming rates of evictions, skyrocketing rental prices, and the increasing prevalence of precarious housing for Canadians. But the recommendations in this report are minimal. That is why the NDP filed a dissenting report outlining the actions the government could take to make housing a human right. The government has to act now. And so that is why I am going to move the motion to amend the report by deleting all the words after the word that and substituting the following. The 12th report of the Standing Committee on Human Resources, Skills and Social Development and the Status of Persons with Disabilities, presented on Thursday, October 26, 2023, be not now concurred in, but that it be recommitted to the committee for further consideration with a view to consider the role of financialized landlords on the rising costs in Canada's rental market, including how the use of algorithmic pricing tools is contributing to renting increases and how pervasive this practice is across the Canadian rental market.
Well done.
Ms. Zerillo, seconded by Mr. Boulris, moves the following amendment: that the motion be amended by deleting all the words after the word that and substituting the following. Quote, the 12th report of the Standing Committee on Human Resources, Skills and Social Development and the Status of Persons with Disabilities, presented on Thursday, October 26, 2023, be now not concurred in, and that it be recommitted to the committee for further consideration with a view to consider the role of financialized landlords on rising costs in Canada's rental market, including how the use of algorithmic pricing tools is contributing to rent increases and how pervasive this practice is across the Canadian rental market. The amendment is in order. Questions and comments? Question and commentaire. The honourable member for Kings House.
Speaker, I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for her remarks today. A few things I agree with, a few things that I might probe and that I might have a different view. One, I would certainly agree with the fact that there have been successive federal governments in the past that had not properly invested in public housing, and we have been playing catch-up as a government over the last number of years that we've been involved. The member took a lot of time to focus on rental costs and rental increases. She talked about the Government of Canada, presumably around assets that may be held by government entities who serve as landlords. And she talked about rent increases there, but will the honourable member recognize that rent increases and rent control is actually inherently a provincial jurisdiction, that these are tools that are controlled in provincial legislatures, and although yes, there's work as the government is doing and as we need to do more at the federal level, specifically when she talks about rent, is that not something that is governed in legislatures that need to be conversations with premiers across this country that we are having, but constitutionally we don't have the authority?
The honourable member for Port Moody Coquitlam.
Mr. Speaker, no, I won't. Because people that are living in encampments and in their cars and being rent-evicted and don't have housing don't care whose jurisdiction it is. I'm telling the government right now that what they're doing is making people homeless. And there's no other fix for it other than stopping this financialization of housing. People are losing their homes. The government is behind it. They're involved in it. They're encouraging it. I would ask the member to go take a look at some of the annual reports of some of their investment boards, specifically the PSP Investment Board, who, by the way, the new board chair won't see me, won't take an appointment, no transparency, no ability to push back on them. They're making above their guideline profits. The government needs to look inside.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. L'honorable.
The honourable member for Joliette. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for her speech. I would like to ask her, well, the government has invested a lot in affordable housing, so we hear a lot of criticism because very often promoters prefer paying a fine rather than developing units that are supposed to be affordable. Or often they're not affordable if they're developed over 10 years and prices remain high. Some organizations like the Fondation Populaire that came to the Finance Committee proposes that all money for affordable housing should be sent to off-market social housing such as co-ops. What does my honourable colleague think of this?
The honourable member.
Thank you. This is another. I thank the member for the question. This is another example of how the government has been told over and over what to do to fix this problem, and they're doing nothing. When I was preparing for this speech today, I was speaking to some of the people that testified at this HUMA committee on study on financialization of housing. They're saying, "Why has the government done nothing?" I absolutely agree that those investments in social housing need to happen. The NDP are calling for it. The Bloc Now IEC are calling for it. The government is doing nothing, and we know the Conservatives will cut any investments in social housing.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Hamilton Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the honourable member who's done a phenomenal job on this file as the member from Rosemont-Le-Petit-Patrie. But I have to say, you know, the Liberals like to pretend that if only there was somebody in power who could do something about this, and they want to pretend that laissez-faire economics, leaving it to the market, is somehow going to solve this crisis. And yet there was a time in this country, Mr. Speaker, a time when the Victory Homes Project after World War II, a bold initiative to build 1 million homes, and we're talking about in the 50s and 60s, 1 million homes for people, for affordability, for soldiers who came back, and for people who can afford them. They still have them in Hamilton. In fact, in my neighborhood where I grew up, that's what we had there. There was a Victory Homes Project that became the CMHC, and somewhere along the line, the CMHC, Mr. Speaker, just became this kind of insurance backstop for REITs and big developers. So through you to the honourable member, could she speak a little bit about how not only is this possible for the federal government to build 1 million non-market housing, not only is it possible, but it already happened some 50, 60 years ago, and it needs to happen now.
With the whole 30 seconds remaining, the honourable member Port Moody Coquitlam.
I just want to thank my honourable member across the way there for this such important history of what CMHC was supposed to do. And CMHC came to Human multiple times. They're a risk management company now. They do risk management. The very own CEO of CMHC said, "Oh, we're not in the business of social housing. We're not in the business of supportive housing. They don't even know how to do it," she admitted. They're risk managers. It's terrible.
Before resuming debate, I believe the government House Leader is handing out a point of order.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The government will be tabling a response to one more petition today. Thank you very much.
Appreciate the clarification. Resuming debate, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, it's interesting times. There's no doubt about that in terms of what takes place in Parliament nowadays. We have before us, once again, another concurrence motion. And it's a really important issue. It's one of those issues I would suggest to you that Canadians are very much concerned about. It's an issue in which ultimately no government in the history of Canada has actually invested more real dollars than this Prime Minister and this government. That has never seen as much cash and other resources flow to a sector. That is the reality. Whether opposition members want to recognize it or not, that is the reality of the situation. And I want to be able to expand at great length on that shortly, Mr. Speaker. But I want to be able to also provide a comment in terms of where we are as a parliament. Because you'll know that we have not had any sort of discussion on legislative bills that are before the House. Some very important pieces of legislation, Mr. Speaker. And some of it would be direct, maybe more so indirect, even dealing with the issue that we have before us today, Mr. Speaker. But instead what we have seen is different forms of things brought to the floor in order to prevent that discussion or that debate from occurring. The best example we can give is the one where we have seen the Conservative Party moving a motion. And I'll quote the motion from the Speaker that the Conservative Party actually moved, Mr. Speaker. And it was that the government's failure to fully providing documents as ordered by the House on June 10, 2024 be hereby referred to the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs. Now, the reason why I mention that, Mr. Speaker, is because I think it's important that we realize, in good part, why it is that we're actually debating the report that we're debating today. Because the Conservatives, in their wisdom or their lack of, have made the decision to prevent any sort of debate on a wide spectrum of issues by filibustering their own motion. And by doing that, Mr. Speaker, now we have seen the members of the Bloc, members of the New Democrats, actually bring in concurrence reports. And in the past, I was very critical of concurrence reports being brought in. But I can appreciate the frustration that other political entities are having inside the House because, like myself, what they see is the Conservatives playing games and denying the opportunity of Canadians to see a lot of positive debate and votes take place on issues that are critically important to them. And I find that that is unfortunate, Mr. Speaker. And hopefully, at some point in time, we will be able to acknowledge that, yes, there are important issues in concurrence motions. We know there's actually well over 100 reports that are out there. We could spend every day from now until September of 2025 talking about a concurrence report. Some might be a little bit more interesting than others. Like, I love this. I like this concurrence report in the sense, Mr. Speaker, it's relevant in terms of the issue that Canadians are concerned about. And it provides us the opportunity to get on the record on some of the things that the federal government is actually doing. The unfortunate reality of it, however, is it continues to support and allow for the Conservative Party to ultimately filibuster that very simple motion that was put to the House, that all members of the House actually want to see voted on, except for the Conservatives, so that we're better able to deal with the important issues that Canadians have to face.
and deal with. And that's why day in and day out we're appealing to the Conservative Party to start putting the interests of Canadians ahead of the leadership ambitions of the current leader and the Conservative Party in general here in Ottawa, Mr. Speaker. And that is something in which we hope that over the next number of days, weeks, whatever it takes, that they'll become a little bit more sensitized to the issues that Canadians are having to face, and ultimately work with other political entities in the chamber so that we can have the types of debates that are necessary to have here on the floor of the House of Commons. Having said all that, housing, that's a very big issue. I recognize that. There's nothing new there, Mr. Speaker. We know that housing is something that has been needed to be looked at, not for this year, previous years. We've started boldly a number of years ago on the housing file. When I started off, I said no other prime minister or government has done more in terms of contributing to the bigger picture of housing in Canada than this prime minister and this government. That is a fact, Mr. Speaker. No government has worked as diligently as this government has in terms of working with provinces, territories, Indigenous communities, every region of the country, the many different stakeholders that are out there. As a government, we've been very proactive on the housing file. Contrast. You know, if we were to contrast what it is that we have done, even better yet, Mr. Speaker, let's contrast the leader of the Conservative Party to the Prime Minister, the leader of the Liberal Party, on the housing issue file. It doesn't take very much to expand on the leader of the Conservative Party. Let me tell you why. He was actually the housing minister when Stephen Harper was the Prime Minister. And we've had many ministers talk about how enthusiastic the leader of the Conservative Party was on housing when he was actually the Minister of Housing. He actually built 6 houses in Canada. 6. Now, to the best of my knowledge, we haven't found any of those 6 houses, but we're told that there are 6 houses that he actually built while he was Minister of Housing, Mr. Speaker. Pretty impressive background. If you want to start contrasting that to what the leader of the Liberal Party or the Prime Minister of Canada has done, I think people would get a better understanding and appreciation in terms of who really understands the needs and the housing-related issues as a leader. Yesterday, we were entertained with a Conservative idea. They don't have very many of them, but we had one that floated to the top yesterday. It's a rare occurrence. And what they're saying now is that if you buy a house, $900,000, let's say, you're going to be able to not have to pay the GST on that house. That's their gift to the housing situation that Canada is facing today. At the same time, the leader of the Conservative Party says, not only are we giving that as a gift to Canadians, we're also going to be cutting back on other federal programs dealing with housing, Mr. Speaker. I found it really interesting when you had the leader of the Conservative Party today. He said, well, we're helping homelessness. It begs the question, how many people in homeless shelters do you think are going to benefit by building a $900,000 home in the next year or so? I suspect, Mr. Speaker, you're not going to get any of them. Their policy is so, I don't quite understand. I think, maybe he got the idea when we talked about as a government that we were going to get rid of the GST on purpose-built rentals, where not only was it well received in Canada, we also had provincial jurisdictions doing the likewise on the PST. That in itself is going to lead to thousands of units being built across the country, Mr. Speaker. So here you see a very strong and positive announcement from the government of Canada, and now you get the leader of the Conservative Party saying, well, we have a better idea. We're going to actually just give a GST break for those that are buying housing, buying a brand new house, and we'll put a cap of just under $1 million on it, Mr. Speaker. How does that deal with affordable housing? I can tell you right offhand, it deals with it in a very negative way, because he says, while he's talking about this shiny new Conservative program, he's also going to be cutting the programs that are actually going to do just that, make more affordable housing across Canada, Mr. Speaker. Their policy statement just does not make any sense unless there's a theme that he wants to develop. And that is this theme of axe the tax. I even saw him making the motion today, Mr. Speaker, when he goes like this. And I see him do it inside the House and outside the House, talking about axing the tax. Believing that he can fool Canadians. That's what it's about. He's trying to give an impression that Canadians are going to benefit because he's going to axe the GST tax on those building a brand new house, Mr. Speaker. How many Canadians do you think are really going to benefit by that major policy announcement, in particular those that need the issue of affordable housing, especially when you factor in the fact that he's going to be canceling other programs? Interesting enough, the Conservatives are critical publicly here in the House of the Minister of Housing in regards to the Accelerator Fund. They talk and they say, that's one of the programs they're going to axe. I could not believe when you take a look at Newswatch and you become very much familiar with a number of the members of the Conservative caucus that disagree, at least by writing the Minister of Housing, with what it is that the Conservative leader is saying himself. When you start getting letters from Conservatives asking for additional support on the housing file and appealing to the Minister of Housing for support on an initiative in the riding, and I applaud those members, Mr. Speaker. They're doing what it is that they should be doing, advocating for their constituents, even though their leader is advocating to get rid of the program. I find that there's something odd about that. I know there's at least 5, and I understand there's even more potentially there, Mr. Speaker. The member from Lambton, Kent, Middlesex, and the number of communities that are affected, and the letter that was written, I sure hope it was good. You had the member from Simcoe North, the member from Fundy Royal. You gotta like this one. The member from St. Albert, Edmonton. The member from Central Okanagan. My apologies for the mispronunciation, Mr. Speaker. What do they have in common? They all have, and there's, I suspect, more, but here's 5 that we know of, 2 things in common. One is that they're all Conservatives. 2, they all want the government program. The government program that the leader of the Conservative Party wants to get rid of, Mr. Speaker, in favor of his announcement yesterday. And today, time after time, we had the leader of the Conservative Party stand in his place and say, oh, how good I am because look what so-and-so is saying about my announcement. At the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, I would suggest that the Conservative Party needs to rethink their housing policy. While they're doing that, they also might want to rethink their price on pollution policy, because they've had a few flip-flops on that one, Mr. Speaker, and I would suggest to you that if they want to do the environment a favor, they should have yet another flip-flop. Shortly after coming into government, we established the National Housing Strategy. Think in terms of affordable housing initiative, the rapid housing initiative. Through supports of that nature, Mr. Speaker, we were able to repair, renew, and see construction, literally of tens of thousands of homes in Canada, in the different regions, Mr. Speaker, talking about repair, renew, and other homes under constructions, providing loans and more to ensure that the capital gets off the ground. We can talk about the support for nonprofit, low-income housing that has been ongoing. The federal government provides hundreds of millions in subsidies to ensure that people can actually afford housing and living in that nonprofit housing, Mr. Speaker. We've had other programs that might not be as direct as one would like to see, but they're very important programs. I'm thinking of the Greener Homes program, a program that provided support for individuals that want to make their homes more energy efficient, a program that was taken up by thousands of Canadians throughout the country, Mr. Speaker. Co-op housing is a government. We believe in co-op housing and we support it in a very tangible way. We want to see more co-op homes being built, Mr. Speaker, because there is a difference when you're a resident of a co-op versus a tenant in an apartment block. And if I had more time, I would go in much more greater detail on that, Mr. Speaker. The Rapid Housing Initiative and the Housing Accelerator Fund, here there's a fundamental difference between the Conservatives and the Liberals. For us, we understand that the federal government has a strong leadership role to play on housing, and we are doing just that, Mr. Speaker. But you have to work with municipalities, provinces, territories, Indigenous communities, the wide spectrum of stakeholders that are out there, like Habitat for Humanity, who does fantastic work. I suspect that Habitat for Humanity has built more new homes in Winnipeg North, in particular in areas that are more challenged than any other organization, including government. Stakeholders play a very important role, and we have been there to support them, Mr. Speaker. Whether it's the Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Finance, or the Prime Minister, constantly looking at ways, working with the Minister of Housing and caucus colleagues in participating and bringing ideas on how we can improve Canada's housing stock and expand it, Mr. Speaker. I remember the Housing Accelerator Fund and the opportunity. You know, it was great when the Prime Minister came to Winnipeg and we had the Premier, the Prime Minister, and the Mayor of Winnipeg talking about how all three levels of government, by working together, we're going to be able to accomplish so much more. These are the types of things that we need to see more of. That's where the challenge is to members opposite. We have invested, we understand the issue, we know that there's still more work that needs to be done, but as a national government, you cannot tell me any other national government in our history, in generations, that has done more on the housing file than this Prime Minister and this government, Mr. Speaker. And it doesn't mean that things are perfect. it does mean that we will continue to work for Canadians, Mr. Speaker, on this very serious issue. I would appeal to the Conservative Party in particular to stop the games that they're playing on the floor of the House of Commons, and let's get to work for Canadians and put our party interest behind the interests of Canadians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire, the honourable member for Port Moody Coquitlam.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I have one question for the member. Will the government support the NDP amendment and get this rent price fixing investigated in committee? Because your caucus colleagues at HUMA are currently shielding ultra-wealthy corporate landlords from testifying.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's a number of things I would love to see the Standing Committee ultimately deal with. The issue of rent controls and so forth. I was an MLA for a number of years, and rent control is actually provincial jurisdiction. Having said that, I do believe that there is a role for our standing committees, especially after yesterday's announcement, where we see the official opposition saying that the best way to deal with housing in the country is to give a tax break to people that are going to be building, houses under $1 million, and that's supposed to resolve the homelessness issue. It's supposed to resolve the affordable housing issue. I think we need a better education of Conservative members in order to be able to ensure that there's good, sound public policy when it comes to housing. And I would really recommend to all committee members that we take a look in terms of what it is that the Conservative Party is actually talking about. And maybe it might cause a few of them to change their mind and backtrack, possibly do a flip-flop on their most recent announcement, because that would definitely be in the best interest of Canadians.
Questions and comments? Honourable Lambton, Kent, Middlesex.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I listened with interest to my colleague opposite as he's naming members like myself who will never apologize for standing up for my constituents and standing up for the mayors and for the wardens and for the municipalities that write into me and ask me to advocate on their behalf. And Mr. Speaker, through you, I'd like to ask the member if he's talked to his own members of the Liberal Party who represent ridings in London, which includes Middlesex County, and if they've actually written a letter to their own minister to ask for funding. Because I think if you look, you would find that the two sitting members from London have never actually stood up for the County of Middlesex and have never written a letter on their behalf asking them to look at a funding application that actually makes sense for the city itself. So I ask, Mr. Chair, if the member opposite would stand up for his constituents the way Conservative MPs are willing to stand up for their constituents, even in opposition.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, you're not standing up for your constituents if you have your leader running around saying kill the program and knowing full well that if the Conservatives were to form government that the program would be a puff of smoke and disappear. That's not advocating for your constituents. The member should be taking the issue that she just finished raising, and if she believes in the program, she should be expressing that within her caucus. I'm glad that she wrote a letter to the minister, Mr. Speaker, but I would suggest that she should show that letter to the leader of the Conservative Party and tell him to take a flip-flop on the issue.
The Honourable Member for Beauport-Limoilou. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We're undeniably in the midst of a housing crisis, and we are unable to meet all the housing needs in Canada and Quebec. Often we mention affordable housing, and we talk about social housing here in the Bloc Québécois. And there's a major important difference, and I wonder if my colleagues in the government are aware of what the difference is. Now, affordable housing might cost 10% less than market price, but social housing is calculated according to the person's income, and in the sense that it doesn't go beyond 30% of that person's income. Is the government aware of this, and will it end up applying these important principles so that social housing can be truly accessible The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Absolutely, I know the difference. I was actually the housing critic in the province of Manitoba, where we had roughly, again, I'm dating it, but there's just over 15,000, probably 15,000 to 20,000 fully subsidized units that's based strictly on income. And we continue, and that's why I said there's hundreds of millions that goes towards ongoing support of individuals in nonprofit housing and affordable housing in different forms. So whether it's 100% subsidized, 100% subsidized, or it's that 10% subsidy through other mechanisms, we understand that there needs to be a smorg or of different forms of housing. I am a very strong advocate, for example, for housing co-ops. I think that there's all sorts of programs also to be there for nonprofit organizations. I also like to think that we need to see the different levels of government come up to the table and look at how we can build more homes and have them as nonprofit houses and units. I think that there's a need that's there, and thank goodness that we started when we did with the National Housing Strategy a number of years ago.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Deputy House Leader.
You see, the problem with the intervention from the member from Lambton, Kent Middlesex a few moments ago, Mr. Speaker, is that she's trying to paint the picture now that she's just defending her constituents, standing up for her constituents. But the reality is that she doesn't do that in the House when it comes to these programs. Instead, during question period and every other opportunity, she just tells us repeatedly that that this government is failing her constituents. But then, behind everybody's back, she goes and writes a letter to the Minister of Housing saying, can we please get some of this money because we see value in this program? It's the same thing that the member from Simcoe North, Fundy Royal, St. Albert Edmonton, and Central Okanagan Simickaleen is doing. The exact same thing. So it's all about the hypocrisy about what's going on here. Is on the one hand, they're saying this government is completely failing Canadians, but on the other hand, they go behind everybody's back and write letters to the minister directly. See, I don't hear her, despite the fact she's heckling me right now, I don't hear her standing up in this House saying, that's such a great program. By the way, did you get my letter? Because we're waiting to get some money too. I'm wondering if the Parliamentary Secretary can comment on that hypocrisy.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I believe my friend and colleague did a wonderful job in pointing out the issue, and he made reference to 5 names. I'm thinking as he's speaking that maybe we should have some sort of a production of papers from the Minister of Housing in terms of all the letters that he has received from Conservatives asking for support in doing in the housing programs, Mr. Speaker. We might all be surprised. Maybe there might be a majority of the Conservatives, and if we can get a majority of the Conservatives agreeing with what the member from, Lambton and Kent and Middlesex, if we can get a majority agreeing with her and her other colleagues, maybe then the leader of the Conservative Party will take a flip-flop on the issue, Mr. Speaker. That might be, it would definitely be in the interest of Canadians if, in fact, they took that flip-flop, Mr. Speaker. But it does beg the question, should we be asking the Minister of Housing if we can get that unanimous support to provide all the letters from the Conservative members requesting finances? I don't know, Mr. Speaker. Can I ask that as a unanimous consent?
Yes. The honourable member is asking for unanimous consent to table those. Is it agreed? No, I'm hearing a number of no's. Questions and comments? The honourable member for Hamilton Centre.
The only thing more exaggerated than the honourable member of Winnipeg North is the Liberal National Housing Strategy itself. You'll recall that they made an announcement of $75 billion that was supposed to go out. $12 billion, which was already money spent, $37 billion that went into nowhere. We know in this moment, they like to pretend like Canadians have never had it so good, but I know Winnipeg is a lot like Hamilton. There's going to be a winter coming, and it's going to be very cold in Winnipeg, and there are going to be people on the streets dying. So will this member finally stand up and just admit laissez-faire economics, leaving it to the market, dishing money out to private developers is a failed policy, and this government has a responsibility to actually do what it did some 50 years ago and be bold and build purpose-built, non-market social housing? Yes or no?
With 43 seconds or so, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, I can assure the member that there has not, and that's why I challenge him. He cannot tell me a Prime Minister or a government that has done more on the national housing scene than this Prime Minister and this government. He might not like that, but the reality is when you compare the Liberals' performance, contrast that to Thomas Mulcair when he was the leader of the official opposition with the NDP and during that 2015 election, you will find that the Liberal platform outdid the NDP platform on housing, and not only did we outdo it, we're actually implementing it. Having said that, we do appreciate the support that we get from the NDP.
Reprise du débat. Well, Matt, actually, before we do that, I'm going to do this. It's my duty pursuant to Standing Order 38 to inform the House that the questions we raised tonight at the time of adjournment are as follows. The Honourable Member for Langley Aldergrove on taxation.
The Honourable Member for Calgary Centre on government responsibility.
Honourable Member for Calgary Nose Hill, government accountability. Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's always an honour to rise on behalf of the residents of Kelowna Lake Country, and I'll be splitting my time today with the member from Mission, Matsqui, Fraser Canyon. Today we are discussing this report that we had put through the Human Resources Committee or the Housing Committee, and I wanted to just point out quickly that the Conservatives had put forth a dissenting report on this, and I just want to read a couple of points that we made in our dissenting report. First of all, we said that we will not get out of the housing crisis without building more homes. To build more homes, we need everyone pulling in the same direction, the federal government, provincial, municipal, workers, and yes, the private sector. Demonizing, taxing, and blocking private sector involvement in Canada's housing market will not only keeps us from solving Canada's housing crisis, but could actually make it worse. And then we reference some statistics in here. To reach 22 million units by 2030, the CMHC says we must build 3.5 million more units beyond what we will build anyhow. And the CMHC says that those 3.5 million units that are required by 2030 will require, quote, an investment of at least $1 trillion to build. The CMHC says we will need increased participation from the private sector to meet these goals. Conservative members support 60-day average approvals at the CMHC, linking bonuses for CMHC executives to performance metrics and balancing the budget to lower interest rates so that we can unleash non-governmental organizations and others. And so here's a few points that I just wanted to make out at the onset of this debate here today. And I'd like to set the template for where housing is in Canada right now. So under this Liberal government, housing has never been more expensive. The Liberals' failure to build homes has created a housing crisis for Canadians. And in fact, this House of Commons has said that we are in a housing crisis. The cost of mortgage payments and down payments have all doubled under this Liberal government. And before this Liberal government, or we could say the NDP Liberal government, because they've been supporting them, it took 25 years to pay off a mortgage, whereas now it actually takes 25 years to save for a down payment. So this is one of the reasons why young adults, so many of them in the country, are saying that they feel they will never be able to afford a mortgage. It's very demotivating and really, really frustrating for our young adults here in Canada. The Liberals' record on housing, mortgages and rents is really nothing for them to be proud of. Instead of building homes that Canadians need, they have been building more bureaucracy. And, we hear a lot about the bureaucracy at the Federal Housing Agency, the CMHC. At the Housing Committee, we've done a number of studies recently, and we've had a lot of testimony from different witnesses talking about how the Federal Housing Agency will add costs because of certain rules that they put in place, building rules that are far and above of actual requirements, and that they'll also add in a whole number of other rules that actually can add a lot of costs and time and delays onto building housing. We've heard quite a bit about this at the Housing Committee. Now, we also know that 9 years after this Prime Minister promised to lower the price of housing, rents and mortgages have doubled, and middle-class Canadians are forced to live in tent encampments in nearly every city across the country. We are seeing record number of tent encampments opening. And the photo ops that we've seen from this Liberal government won't come anywhere near close to building the 5.8 million homes that are needed to restore housing affordability in Canada. As a result, home prices have doubled, rent has doubled, down payments have doubled, and mortgages have also doubled. There was a report done by CMHC earlier in October that showed that housing starts continue to trend lower while Canada's population has rapidly increased. And when you compare September 2024 to September 2023, the results are even worse. Across the country, housing starts were down 15% this September compared to September of 2023. And similarly, in Canada's most expensive cities, the Liberal government's billion-dollar photo op fund has really done nothing to build more homes because housing starts are actually down 20% in Vancouver and in Toronto. Statistics Canada also recently reported that the total value of building permits has decreased by 7% in August of this year. And as well, recently Rentals.ca published their national rent report, which shows the consequences of this of the Liberal failure. It means the costs of rent have massively outpaced Canadian paychecks. It is just really one bad statistic after another. Also, when we look at homelessness, this is an issue in my community of Kelowna Lake Country, also across the country. And the Parliamentary Budget Officer released a detailed report in May of this year outlining the state of homelessness in Canada. And the Liberal government committed to eliminating chronic homelessness by 2030. However, according to this report, since 2018, chronic homelessness has actually increased by 38%. It also stated in this report the number of individuals living in unsheltered locations has increased by a staggering 38%. And these aren't just statistics, these are people, these are family members, these are neighbors. And so what I'd like to discuss now is a recent announcement made by our leader of the official opposition about a plan that Conservatives have to really lower the cost for Canadians looking to buy a home. And so our common sense Conservative leader announced that we will axe the federal sales tax, or GST, as it's called, on new homes sold under $1 million. So this cut will save $40,000 or $2,200 per year in mortgage payments on an $800,000 house, as an example. And this tax cut will spark 30,000 extra homes built every year. Common sense Conservatives will also push provinces to remove their sales tax from new home sales, which would save tens of thousands of dollars more for home buyers. Now, the move really comes after this housing crisis, as I have mentioned, which has doubled housing costs over the 9 years of this NDP Liberal government, which is also, I want to note, faster than any other G7 country. Now, back in October of 2025, the month before the Liberals were elected, it took only 39% of the median pre-tax household income to cover home ownership costs. Now it takes nearly 60%. That is a staggering difference and a staggering amount for Canadian families. Well, it used to be normal for working-class youth to buy homes. Now 80% of Canadians tell pollsters home ownership is only for the very, very rich. The GST alone adds about $50,000 in cost to a $1 million home. And this fund, the Common Sense Conservative tax reduction, is really going to eliminate billions of dollars in bureaucratic programs that the Liberals admit have not built a single home. That's what will be offset by the difference. As I mentioned, this tax cut will spark extra homes being built. What's really missing here is the promise of Canada, where many of us that were the generation that, we were in our 20s, and if you had a decent job, you could have a decent car and you could save up and you could buy your first place. That dream of home ownership is really gone now for our young Canadians, and it's incredibly sad. And we also know that in addition to that we have record-breaking numbers of people going to food banks. It was just reported that now 2 million people are going to food banks in 1 month. And so it's just incredibly hard for young adults and families. Now, on our Conservative proposal, I just want to mention a couple of quotes here. Canadian housing expert Mike Moffat, Senior Director of Policy and Innovation of the Smart Prosperity Institute, said, "This proposal to eliminate the GST for newly constructed homes selling for under $1 million is the boldest middle-class housing proposal released to date from any federal political party. It will put $4 billion back into the pockets of home buyers each year." The Greater Ottawa Home Builders Association said increasing the GST rebate threshold will support affordability, increase housing supply, and restore fairness to current and future generations of home buyers. And so, and there are more quotes as well. I know that I'm running out of time here, Mr. Speaker, but this is really important, and we really hope that the government will follow the proposal made by Conservatives to axe the federal tax on homes under $1 million, new housing. Thank you very much.
Questions and comments. Question commentaire. The honourable member for London Fanshawe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm concerned, and it comes from a lot of the questions, the points that my colleague from Port Moody Coquitlam asked earlier in the day, and it was around why in the HUMA committee, Conservatives and Liberals got together and joined ranks to ensure that the committee wouldn't study and bring forward CEOs' big corporate interests to committee to hear about that financialization of housing that we know is driving up the cost of housing. I'd really love to hear the honourable member's explanation of why she joined with the Liberals to block that from happening at committee. Thank you.
The honourable member for Colonial Lake Country.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, I know that I can't use a prop in this place, but there is a 61-page report called The Financialization of Housing that was completed by the committee, and I referenced a dissenting report as well that we did. And of course, any members of the committee can bring forth witnesses in order to testify, and all party members did. And so we had a very robust study actually on this. It's called The Financialization of Housing, and it was October of 2023. Anyone can go online and have a look at that and view all of the testimony and many recommendations that actually came out of this study.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Deputy House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm wondering if the member can explain to the House that if this accelerator fund was such a failure, why it was that the member from Lambton, Kent, Middlesex, Simcoe North, Fundy Royal, and others asked for funds for their communities from it. If they believe that it is a failure too, does that mean that they knowingly asked for money from a program that they knew was a failure?
That's a good question.
The honourable member for Colonial Lake Country.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, we know that we're in a housing crisis right now, and this is under the 9 years of this Liberal government. And it was actually the housing minister himself that had actually said that that particular fund that the member is referring to doesn't actually build any homes. And so this is why Conservatives keep bringing forth suggestions on ways to build homes and ways for Canadians to get into housing, in particular for new home owners. And that was one of the recommendations and the announcement that was made yesterday by the official opposition leader in order to axe the federal tax on new homes built under $1 million. This will prompt new home building, and this will prompt people in order to get into homes and really help with the affordability and the housing crisis that we're having here in Canada.
Questions and comments, the honourable member for Rimouski Nejet, Témiscouata Basque. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Conservatives are asking what their plan is. We know that the former leader said he has a plan for Quebecers. I have a contract, but I'd like my colleague to explain what the plan is. Now we're debating a study on the financialization of housing, but a year ago in October 2023, the Conservative Party wasn't necessarily agreeing on some measures. And now a year later, while the crisis is still raging, since there hasn't been an answer, they come up with a new measure, GST exemption on new housing. I'd like my colleague to explain why they didn't think of this a year ago rather than now thinking of this. It sounds like they're just improvising. I'd like them to explain, with details possibly, the reflections of the Conservative Party.
Kelowna Lake Country.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for the question. Well, we're continually putting out recommendations and continually making suggestions and continually making announcements on a whole number of ways that we can fix so much that this government has broken. I mean, whether you're looking at now having a housing crisis, whether you're looking at crime, whether you're looking at record numbers of people going to the food bank, we are continually making suggestions and recommendations on an ongoing basis, and the announcement that came yesterday is another example of that.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Mission Mascouy Fraser Canyon.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. It's always an honor to stand up on behalf of British Columbians and, in fact, all Canadians when we tackle the important issue of housing. Right before I came into this chamber, one of the interns in my office, as I prepared my notes for this speech, said, wow, the Liberal government's approach to housing sort of reminds me of a famous quote by the former United States President Ronald Reagan. Hi, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. No more is this, there's no other scenario in Canada where this quote makes total sense. We have a government that put forward nearly $100 billion, and their record is this. Housing costs have doubled, rent has doubled, the ability for a young person to save up for a home, let alone afford rent, has gone beyond their reach. If we've ever seen a government mismanage a portfolio so badly, it is indeed this government's approach to housing. Now, where I live in British Columbia, many Canadians mourn the fact that they will never have the opportunity to own a home. In fact, they feel helpless, that the Canada they once knew is not the Canada today, primarily because of how this government has tackled or attempted to tackle housing. For example, in the Fraser Valley right now, the average cost of a townhouse is $750,000. A down payment for a townhouse modestly would be about $55,000 to cover the down payment, maybe some of the legal costs, real estate fees, etc. That's a very modest number. Now, if we took a very fortunate young Canadian, say making a salary of about $85,000 in British Columbia, that would give you take-home pay of about $5,300 a month and change. But if you look at what the cost of living is today, say you're commuting to work and your gas bill is $100 a week, so $400 that you're spending on gas every single week. You have to pay ICBC insurance. That's about $125 if you're a good driver. For your phone and internet bill, you're looking at about $160. For gas and hydro for your home, you're looking at about $120. For, say, a single person, you're looking at around $750 a month for food, $150 a month for clothing, toiletries, maybe some basic household items, $500 for a car payment, maybe some miscellaneous costs, and $2,500 for the average rent. Now, this is a modest understanding of what the average young single person in Canada is facing. They have and I didn't even talk about cost of student loans or other debt that they might have and are paying for on a monthly basis. But if you tabulate all those numbers up together on that salary of $5,300 and change, you're going to be left with about $650 at the end of the month that you're going to be able to save up for a home. Now, at that rate, you're going to take about 7 years and a month to save up for a down payment. That's actually a pretty accurate scenario. It's actually similar to what my wife and I had to do to get into our first home in that style of price range. But, you know, if you look at what youth are facing today, the youth unemployment rate for young Canadians between the ages of 15 and 24 is 13.5%. And the Canadian Income Survey outlines that in 2022, the average income for a Canadian worker was only $55,000. So the average young Canadian today, Mr. Speaker, is just facing a whole host of impediments to get to where they thought they would be in their life today. That is one of the biggest issues facing our country. And I'm going to point out, you know, the NDP and the Liberals, they often say, oh, the Conservatives are going to cause extremism. No, Mr. Speaker, it's the NDP Liberal government that has taken away hope from an entire generation who are going to push to the far left and the far right because of their disastrous policies and what they have done. I've lived under an NDP government in British Columbia for 7 years and 9 years of Justin Trudeau, and I have never seen it so bad. And Mr. Speaker, I take that back. I apologize. Under the Prime Minister. And you know what? In my riding, you know what? Every night in Canada, there's about 25 to 35,000 Canadians who can't even afford a home or can't even access social housing. And unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, that number is even higher for Indigenous Canadians. Mr. Speaker, 30% of the Canadians who are homeless every night come from one of our First Nations. That is not acceptable. 22% of shelters are aimed at young homeless in Canada, while 20% of people experiencing homelessness are between the ages of 13 and 24. Let's tie that to our unemployment rate, and man, do we have a hard scenario for young people in our country right now. I would be remiss as well, Mr. Speaker, if I didn't outline that since the NDP Liberal government came into power 9 years ago, the budget at Indigenous Services Canada has increased 181%. I shared that with one of the chiefs in my riding recently, and he said, you know, MP from Mission Matsqui Fraser Canyon, if we took even a portion of that money and we gave it directly to First Nations to address childhood poverty, to address housing on reserve, we would be in such a better position than the increase of bureaucrats in Ottawa who are not accountable to the taxpayers of Canada, and they're not accountable to the Indigenous people that rely on their services. Mr. Speaker, we could have done so much better to help Indigenous people who face some of the biggest challenges for housing in this country, along with young Canadians. So that brings me to the announcement that the Honourable Leader of the Conservative Party has made, and that is a simple tax cut that will save the average purchaser of a new home between $40,000 and $50,000. Mr. Speaker, that is not an insignificant amount of money. It will make a big difference in the time it takes to save up for a mortgage and to indeed afford a mortgage if one is successful purchasing a home. Mr. Speaker, of all countries in the developed world, Canada has some of the highest occupancy rates. It's because we have not done enough to spur new home building construction in Canada. In fact, TD Economics just came out with a report on productivity in September of this year, and they said the biggest impediment to Canada's economy is our ability to build homes and fill the jobs in building construction for new homes in Canada. That report also stated that we have to create incentives and maintain incentives that will push people back into the industry to meet the very real challenges we face no matter what area of the country we are in today. Now, throughout this debate so far, Liberal and NDP members have been challenging Canadians on the the money that was given to municipalities to speed up building permits. In fact, my community received $26.5 million under the Accelerator Fund, I believe it's called, Mr. Speaker. Unfortunately, in that very time, since they received $26 million, they put out a proposal to double the DCC charges and to levy a new tax on home builders of $7,500 per unit to fund our infrastructure deficits as it relates to parks and recreation. Homeowners, young Canadians can't afford those costs, and the City of Abbotsford should not be putting their inability to approve new home builds onto the backs of young Canadians who are just trying to get by and have some hope of home ownership. Once again, Mr. Speaker, there are so many big challenges facing our country, but the number one thing that I hear at the doorsteps that people in my riding want me working on is to restore the dream of home ownership. And the Conservative Party is on the right path. Our proposals relate to densification, to incentivizing construction, to building more homes that Canadians need and that they can afford. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The honourable member for Port Moody Coquitlam.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just have one question for the member. Will the Conservatives support the NDP amendment that was tabled today and get this rent price fixing investigated in committee? Because his caucus colleagues at HUMA are currently shielding the ultra-wealthy corporate landlords from testifying.
The honourable member for Mission Massacre Fraser Canyon.
No.
Questions and comments. The honourable parliamentary secretary, government house leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think people are concerned in regards to the mistakes that the leader of the Conservative Party is making. We could talk about his announcement on housing from yesterday, or the security clearance. One that really affects myself, and I think would upset a lot of Canadians, is a more recent decision. When you think of Canada's diversity, I always think of how we have been enriched as a society. And through, for example, Diwali, which we're going to be celebrating over the next coming days, that is something about our heritage. It's a part of our Canadian heritage in terms of who we are as a nation and as a people. And whether, truth over misinformation or light over darkness, the member knows it well. He's very familiar with Diwali. And the leader of the Conservative Party has made the determination that he doesn't want Conservatives to participate in Diwali. Can he explain why?
The honourable member for Mission Massacre Fraser Canyon.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me be very clear. I, along with many of my Conservative colleagues, are blessed to go to Diwali celebrations all across Canada. The statement made by the member opposite is in fact misdirected. Conservatives celebrate Diwali, and I celebrate that Canadian heritage with thousands of my constituents who use the opportunity where light conquers darkness. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Joliette. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for their speech. My question is about two articles in The Economist that appeared 2 weeks ago that were severely criticizing the government and the PM by targeting the issue of housing. As we've often repeated here, in 9 years, costs have skyrocketed. There is 66% increase overall, and Canada is really one of the only countries in the OECD that is like this, except for Australia. But the number one factor behind this in these articles says the increase in the population through immigration without an accompanying plan to develop housing and social services. This may explain the government's recent flip-flop, but I'd like to hear from my colleague, what are the new targets that the Conservative Party would find acceptable? Thank you.
Mission Massacre Fraser Canyon.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't have an exact number on immigration at hand, but I believe, as the Member of Parliament for Mission Massacre Fraser Canyon, that immigration should be tied to Canada's ability to integrate newcomers. Immigration should be tied to our ability to have hospitals that can serve our population, schools that can serve our population. Immigration needs to be done in a responsible way. And what's so scary is that the NDP Liberal government has destroyed the Canadian consensus on immigration due to their mismanagement. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. I know for Lambton, Kent, Middlesex.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for his great speech. Mr. Speaker, through you, I'd like to ask my colleague, and he mentioned that he has young people in his community, as do I, in my riding of Lambton, Kent, Middlesex, who are thinking that the dream of home ownership is out of their reach. And we heard our leader this week make an announcement about taking the GST off of new home builds, and I can tell you that in my constituency, there's a lot of new home developments, and some of them are actually on hold because people can't afford to buy those homes right now. And what we've seen from the NDP Liberal government is is programs such as the one that the members were talking about earlier, the Housing Accelerator Fund, where not a single house has been built. And I have numerous developers in my riding who are trying to build houses, but unfortunately young people can't afford them. So I'm just wondering if you would like to make some comments on the common sense Conservative plan to get homes built.
The honourable member for Mission Matsqui-Fraser Canyon.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Some of the key things the Conservative Party must do to see more homes built in Canada is first and foremost to do what the economist Mr. Moffat said is the single biggest thing we can do for middle-class homes, and that's to incentivize more construction through the elimination of the GST on homes under $1 million. Secondly, we can ensure that there is densification around transit nodules across transit stations across Canada. Third, we need to incentivize municipalities in this country to build more in order to receive more infrastructure dollars from the federal government. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Reprise du débat, et je pense que l'honorable.
Resuming debate. The Honourable Member for Thérèse de Blainville will have 8 minutes to speak before the time is up. The Honourable Member, please. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will be sharing my time. Now, 8 minutes isn't much. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank our NDP colleague for having brought this up, because if he hadn't, I would have. Because at the HUMA committee, I would say this has been one of the most important reports. Of course, several of our reports have been important, but the financialization of housing is particularly important, and this report is 307 pages long. We've heard from many witnesses. Our recommendations were rigorous, but we received a fairly weak response from this government. Now, from the beginning of the debate, even though this is a debate on financialization, we're instead hearing on one side or the other that that such and such is what the Liberal government has done or what the Conservative government would do. It's not as serious as the subject deserves. Now, I will just say for the interpreters that I'll be reading some portions of the report. Let me go back a little bit into the context. This report was presented in October 2023. In September 2022, the Federal Housing Officer's Office had published a report on the financialization of housing in Canada. And the Housing Advocates report went into a variety of different groups, vulnerable groups, people living in group rental housing, renters generally, racialized groups, and so on. And it also looked into the situation elsewhere in the world. The report also contains a number of recommendations for all levels of government in Canada. And what is the financialization of housing? Because that's really what we need to be looking into. One of the authors of the Federal Housing Advocates report on housing financialization, one of these authors is also an adjunct professor at the University of Waterloo, and described the financialization as being the increasing domination of financial actors in housing, which means that housing stops being a place to live, but that instead it becomes a financial asset. And that it ends up becoming a tool for investors. Now, of course, the use of housing to make returns is not new, but what's new here is the use of gigantic multinationals whose main goal is to make maximum returns for shareholders. It's not new that the buildings are privately owned, but what is new is that they're increasingly owned by large institutional investors. Now, what Ms. Auguste also explained at committee was that the financialization of housing has grown and has become a greater issue in the country over the last few decades. It has expanded. It was the federal housing advocate, in fact, who stated that regulatory changes enabled the creation of real estate investment trusts and allowed pension funds to invest in financial markets and instruments. We heard from Madame Houle at committee that in terms of the impacts of financialization of housing, that 20 to 30% of Canada's purpose-built rental housing is owned by institutional investors. Ms. Houle discussed the harm she sees being caused by financialized housing. She indicated that it is contributing to housing unaffordability and worsening housing conditions. This is all leading to evictions and displacement. She explained that the trend towards financialization is violating people's right to adequate housing in Canada, as defined under the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights signed by Canada in 1976, and as enshrined in the National Housing Strategy Act. This troubling report led the committee to hear from witnesses that came to tell us that on a very basic level, the Liberal government's national housing strategy is not working because more than $80 billion has been invested in affordable housing. But on a very basic level, as long as supply and demand is subjected to the laws of the market, as long there's a grain of truth, of course, about supply and demand. Yes, but we need to actually take into account actual demand. And the actual demand in the current housing crisis is the demand for social, non-market housing. To ensure that that housing is actually truly affordable, it needs to be maximum 30% of someone's income, not actually measured as against of per capita median income. My colleague Denis Trudeu, the housing critic, has visited a number of regions of Quebec and made many recommendations. One of the recommendations is to increase non-market housing supply, and that we need to put into place concrete actions to counter financialization. Put an end to this kind of speculation. That's what we're talking about here, and the federal government, its response to the committee's 8 recommendations, the response was simply that the government of Canada recognizes the potential impact of financialization to access to affordable housing and recognizes that there is still work to do. This is extremely lukewarm, even saddening, because this is a serious issue. We looked at it at the HUMA committee, and I think we need to do everything we can to help. We really need to consider the effect of financialization of housing as part of the housing crisis. What we should never forget is that we all have a basic right to a quality and affordable home. It is my duty to now interrupt the debate. This stands deferred to further debate at a later time.
Resuming consideration on a privilege motion concerning the failure to produce documents pertaining to Sustainable Development Technology Canada. Resuming debate on the sub-amendment standing in the name of Mr. Muse.
The Honourable Member for Durham.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I stand in the House today to discuss the corrupt, Liberal $400 million green slush fund. And as I stand here, the former Liberal minister, Navdeep Bains, is literally across the street before the Public Accounts Committee. And he is continuing what has been a long-standing pattern of ducking, dodging, and diving to avoid any accountability and answer any questions about the Sustainable Development Technology Canada scandal, the $400 million Liberal Green Slush Fund. He is avoiding any questions from my Conservative colleagues, and it's not hard to see why when you dig into the rot that has occurred at the SDTC. I'd like to recap, as I begin my comments today, some of the background here, because a lot of Canadians may not be aware of just how horrible the SDTC scandal really is. The SDTC started in 2001 and for years operated without any of this cloud of concern. But with this Liberal government in charge, it became a $400 million slush fund for Liberal elite insiders. The Auditor General conducted an investigation and found the SDTC gave $58 million to 10 ineligible projects that could not demonstrate environmental benefit or the development of green technology. Another $58 million to projects without ensuring contribution agreement terms were met, and a whopping, staggering, Madam Speaker, $334 million to over 186 projects in which board members held a conflict of interest. Now, as I stand here, the former Liberal minister who was supposed to be overseeing this and making sure the SDTC ran properly is across the street denying any knowledge or awareness of these 186 projects with conflicts of interest. The reason the public is able to know what all has gone on there is because of a whistleblower who came forward from the SDTC, a whistleblower who came forward to testify, and I would like to read a quote from the whistleblower's testimony. The current government is more interested in protecting themselves and protecting the situation being a public nightmare, and they would rather protect wrongdoers and financial mismanagement than have to deal with a situation like this. Well, certainly everything we've seen from this Liberal government since the whistleblower's testimony seems to be backing up the assertion that there is a cover-up in place. That's right. That this Liberal government will go to any extent possible to avoid having a real, transparent conversation about the corruption that occurred at the SDTC. Conservatives are asking for basic accountability and for documents to be released and turned over so that the relevant law enforcement authorities can make their own decision about what to do with all of the evidence. But currently, all of the evidence is being withheld because Liberals refuse to comply. Now, a question that I think is natural to ask is, what do my constituents think about this? Because Liberals have gone to great lengths to downplay this as if it's not a matter of broad public interest in our country. And I've had the chance, thankfully, to speak with residents of Durham about this scandal, and it's pretty clear why my constituents are upset. Because $400 million is a lot of taxpayer money to waste. It's a lot of taxpayer money to dish out to Liberal elite insiders in a corruption scandal when we have very, very serious problems in this country that would benefit from taxpayers keeping more of their money and not giving it to the Liberal Party so that they can then send it out the window. So let's put into perspective what $400 million means in real economic terms for the average Canadian. First off, if you do the math, $400 million works out to about $9,700 per person in this country. That is an enormous amount of money for the average Canadian. Make life getting through the rest of this year a lot easier. But they weren't able to keep that tax money for themselves. No. They were overtaxed so that Liberals could take their money and then give it out to their friends. It's no surprise why Canadians are frustrated and upset. What else could you do with $400 million? Well, we are in the middle of a housing crisis in this country. An entire generation of Canadians, me being a millennial, being one of them, as a renter myself, who dreams of owning a home one day. and is now looking at a housing market that looks increasingly unlikely for us to ever participate. There was a time in this country where that could be taken for granted, that you do everything you're asked to do, you finish school, you work hard, you get a job, you pay your taxes, and home ownership would be a realistic, attainable goal. Not the case. So what would $400 million mean in those terms? Well, in my community of Durham, $400 million could buy you over 440 homes. Again, putting into perspective the value of the taxpayer dollars that the Liberals took from the public and dished out to their elite insider friends. In a housing crisis that is completely inexcusable. And yet we have a generation of Canadians continue to have a government turn their backs on us at a time where home ownership is just a distant dream for many. What else could $400,000 do for the Canadian people? Well, if Canadians are able to keep that money, that is the equivalent, based on the average amount of groceries that a family of four buys, according to the Canadian Food Prices Report. $400 million is the equivalent of over 24,000 families buying groceries for a year. Again, we put this into perspective. We have 2 million Canadians lining up at food banks right now. We have people going to grocery stores increasingly feeling the strain of not being able to purchase the things they used to be able to afford just a couple of years ago. Every time I go to the grocery store, I notice people who have to put produce or meat into their cart and then second guess whether they should put it back on the shelf because they're not sure they can afford what they're used to feeding their families. And at a time like that, $400 million being wasted of taxpayer dollars is infuriating, because people are making real compromises on what they purchase from the grocery store every day. And that amount of money amounts to over 24,000 families' grocery bills for an entire year. What else could you do with $400 million? Well, many people in this country right now are struggling with a car ownership, because we have a Liberal government that is increasing a carbon tax that makes it harder to pay for fuel and make use of a vehicle to go to work, to go to school, to get around, take your kid to soccer practice or hockey practice or piano lessons or what have you. And the cost of car ownership has gone up under this government. With $400 million, what could you do with a car if you could keep that money yourself as taxpayers? Well, that is the equivalent of 24,000 Canadians being able to pay for gas, parking, insurance, and car maintenance for an entire year. That's what $400 million means to the taxpayer if Canadians were allowed to keep that money. But instead, it was taken from them. It was taken from them to be dished out to Liberal elite insiders as part of a $400 million green slush fund. Let's continue, shall we, Madam Speaker? What else could you do with $400 million? Well, one of the things I hear from moms and dads a lot in my community is that there are an increasing amount of kids who need more services and support. We have, Lord knows, in my province of Ontario, an epically failing Ministry of Education, which puts an increasing number of children in a position where the day-to-day supports offered by schools just aren't enough to help kids get over the adversity and challenges that they're facing. So I recently heard from a mom and dad who were concerned about not being able to afford speech therapy for their kids. Speech therapy for 1 hour a week for an entire year in the Greater Toronto area, $400 million would do that for over 48,000 children. Again, when you put this in terms of what this money means for the average taxpayer, taking this money away from people has real consequences. And when they hear what is being done with that money, it is no wonder that they are frustrated by the current government and the status quo in this country. Last one, and this is an important one. I say this as a cancer survivor, as someone who has great admiration and appreciation for healthcare workers in this country. And I say this because we have a government in the Liberals that constantly likes to point a finger as if they're the only people who care about healthcare in Canada. Okay, well, if they care so much about healthcare, where is their apology to the Canadian public for spending $400 million of taxpayer money on Liberal elite insiders, which would have been the equivalent of over 60,000 people being able to stay at a hospital? According to the Canadian Institute for Health Information, $400 million would cover over 60,000 hospital stays in the healthcare system we have right now. And so the question then remains, $400 million being wasted of taxpayer money is incredibly concerning for someone who looks at these numbers and says, we have all of these problems stacking up across Canada, and then we hear what is being done with our tax money, and of course, we're frustrated. This is just an inevitability. Now, this is just putting what is a real Liberal scandal in clear economic terms. But, Madam Speaker, I would also like to, thank you. Madam Speaker, I'd also like to touch on why some of the residents of my community in Durham are also frustrated by what's happening with the SDTC scandal, because we are big believers in making real, genuine investments in technology. My constituents in Durham, many of them either work in or have family members who work in the Darlington nuclear facility. It is an incredible facility in Durham region that powers our local economy and generates a tremendous amount of energy for our community. We have seen tremendous technology investments at the Darlington nuclear facility, including medical isotopes, which are now used to help with cancer treatments. We also have the development of small modular nuclear reactors, which will make energy, low carbon emitting energy, more accessible to rural and remote communities. This technology is being exported across the world. These are incredible innovations, and they're happening in my backyard in Durham. So my constituents know that technology investments are actually very, very important. And the Liberal government claimed that that is what was happening with the SDTC. The Liberal government claimed that that $400 million is going to go to technology investments like the kind of investments we know could happen with that money in Durham. But that's not what happened. In fact, we have an industry that employs 89,000 Canadians, adds $17 billion to our GDP each year, and none of that $400 million was used to support our technology developments. None of it was used to support the nuclear industry. In fact, that money was dished out to Liberal elite insiders who, as I recap, were engaged in over 186 conflicts of interest, $58 million to 10 ineligible projects that could not demonstrate environmental benefit or the development of green technology. Well, I can assure you that the Darlington nuclear facility could have used some of that money to continue the great work that's being done there. And I can assure you that the Darlington nuclear facility is developing green technology and does have very clear measurable environmental benefits. Again, we are people in Durham who understand that these technology investments matter, but that is not what we're getting from this Liberal government. Instead, we're getting a cover-up of a scheme that took that money away from projects that could have benefited from it and instead gave it to Liberal insiders. That's right. Now, I'd like to continue with also addressing some of the other concerns related to the police, because we have heard from Liberals ad nauseum over the last few weeks that they are somehow doing the will of the police by opposing a basic request for accountability. And on that, I'd like to say, I do believe, Madam Speaker, that this is part of a broader trend with this Liberal government of frankly not respecting or trusting police officers. We have seen just recently the police associations across Canada, including the Toronto Police Association and the Vancouver Police Association, come out and criticize the Prime Minister and his Liberal policies for increasing crime in our country. We have seen a 116% increase in handgun crime under the current government. And police associations have rung the alarm. They've said, listen to us, please. They're openly saying to the Liberal government, please listen to what us and our members have to say. They are on the ground. They are seeing the consequences of Liberal policies every day. And what are they being told? Well, we've seen the Prime Minister stand here in the House of Commons, and we've seen the Liberal member from Pickering stand here in the House of Commons and accuse those police associations of somehow mimicking talking points from gun lobbies. It is absurd, and it is disrespectful to law enforcement in this country. But it's more than just that. The Minister of Justice has before him right now on his desk a report that makes a series of recommendations about the criminal justice system. And one of those recommendations is cutting police budgets. Yes, It is a recommendation that would take away 25% of the grant dollars from public safety and the Attorney General and the Solicitor General that police organizations are currently able to apply for, and it would say they are no longer eligible for that money. Now, if the Liberal government was as supportive of the police as they claim to be, you would think that they would have just come out and said, oh, this recommendation is absurd. We trust the police. We think they do a good job. They're important institutions in our community. The Liberals would have said, we don't want to even entertain that recommendation. That's not what we heard from the Liberal Minister of Justice. In fact, what we got from the Liberal Minister of Justice is a celebration, Madam Speaker, of that report. He called it, and I quote, history-making and an important milestone. Now, this recommendation is absurd on face value. The more you look at it, the more you can't even believe that the Liberals would even celebrate these kind of policies. But we return back to what we're asking them to do is turn over documents to the police and trust them to make their own decision about what to do with it. That is what basic accountability means. That is all we're asking for. We're not directing the police on what to do. We trust their judgment to make a decision. And in fact, the Liberals do not share that trust in law enforcement. And this goes to a long track record of anti-police bias. It is no wonder when you have a government that has this view of law enforcement, an antagonistic relationship with police unions, a Minister of Justice who is celebrating policy recommendations that will lead to the cutting of police budgets. It's no wonder that they do not have the confidence. Just let the police decide. Turn over the documents and let them decide what they want to do with it. This is basic common sense. So I return, Madam Speaker, to what is happening across the street right now. What is happening across the street right now is that the former Liberal minister, Navdeep Bains, one of the people who are supposed to oversee the SDTC and prevent this stacking up of conflicts of interest and misallocation of funds, he is across the street right now continuing what we have been seeing for months and months, which is that this government does not want to answer questions, does not want to submit to any form of accountability, barely even wants to acknowledge that any wrongdoing was done. This has been a continuous pattern that we continue to see. It's literally happening right now across the street, of thinking that they can misuse that amount of money, $400 million of Canadian taxpayers, and not even have to answer questions of a potential investigation. They could vilify a whistleblower who dares to speak up about what is going on over there. A whistleblower who, again, pointed out and called it right that this government would not want to hold themselves accountable and would do everything they possibly could to downplay this and avoid answering any questions, because for them, the PR side of this is a bigger problem than the taxpayer accountability side. And this entire debate right now that we're having about the $400 million Liberal Green slush fund really does come back to taxpayer accountability. This government is not entitled to everyone's money. No matter how much they like to raise all the taxes, whether it's, and to oppose us on our attempts to lower taxes, they can play all those games all they want, but the reality is they are not entitled to people's money. They introduce policies, and those policies are based on some mechanism of trust with the taxpayer, that every time we pay taxes, that money is going to be used for a good purpose that benefits our communities and our families, that benefits our country. And what we're seeing in this is a betrayal of that trust. A betrayal of that trust at a time where we have very, very serious problems that deserve attention. Very, very serious problems that could be benefited by taxpayers having more of their own money in their pockets. But instead, we are seeing them be overtaxed, and then the spending that comes from that overtaxation actually be done in a way that is entirely reckless. And now when there's a chance to actually have some accountability in that process, for them to not only on this side of the street be trying to downplay the problem, holding Parliament up, refusing to release the documents, but also on that side of the street continue to not answer any questions that we have at committee. Thank you.
Bravo. Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. It's a bit much hearing from the member in regards to being disrespectful to the RCMP when in fact, and I will quote a letter from the RCMP about the game or the tactics that the Conservative Party is using here, and I quote, "There is a significant risk that the motion could be interpreted as a circumvention of normal investigative processes and charter protections." That's from the Commissioner of the RCMP. And the Conservatives say, who cares? We have our political agenda at hand, and they completely disregard what the RCMP are saying. Then, on the other hand, the member says, well, this is all about political liberals lining pockets of liberals. The chairperson was an advisor to Brian Mulroney, Progressive Conservative, Stephen Harper, far-right Conservative, and Jim Flaherty, another Conservative, and donates thousands of dollars to the Conservative Party, yet he calls her a liberal. Madam Speaker, the Conservative Party makes absolutely no sense on this issue. And it feeds into the incompetence of the leader when the leader does not put, when the leader puts the interests of the Conservative Party ahead of the interests of Canadians. And the question to the member opposite, will he not recognize or encourage his leader to do the right thing, to be respectful to Canadians and listen to Canadians and put the Canadian interest ahead of the Conservative Party and his self-interest and get the security clearance so he's better able to deal with the issue of foreign interference? Will he give him the advice to go ahead and get that security clearance?
Honourable Member for Durham.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. You know, I haven't been here for very long. I think it's fair to say I'm a rookie. But I've been here long enough to know how Liberals on the other side of the House like to play the game. I knew these questions were coming. It's a no-brainer. From the National Post on October 12th, interviews Commissioner Mike Duhaime of the RCMP. When asked what the RCMP was investigating specifically, Duhaime said police were exploring a range of theories. Could there be a possibility of corruption? Breach of trust? Is there any fraud, any favoritism? It was brought to our attention and we felt as an organization, okay, let's look into it, and if charges are warranted, charges are warranted. If they're not warranted, we'll explain why we're not charging. Those are the words of the RCMP Commissioner. And all I'm saying is, let's make sure he has all the documents he could possibly need so he can use his judgment and discretion as a chief of police to make the most informed decision possible. What is wrong with that?
Good answer. Some comments. Questions et commentaires, l'honorable.
The Honourable Member for Thérèse de Blainville. Thank you, Madam Speaker. My question is simple. For my colleague, do you think, because we've been studying this question of privilege for over 2 weeks, do you hope that the government is going to give the documents back? But what if the government doesn't produce them? What is your plan? Is your plan to bring forth another question of privilege?
The Honourable Member for Durham.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. My plan is to hold the Liberal government accountable. That's exactly why I'm here, and I'm standing here in the House of Commons right now. My constituents, like Canadians all across our country, know that this government is mismanaging their money and misleading our country. Every Canadian can see from all walks of life that the quality of life in Canada is in decline, and we are holding this government accountable for how they are using $400 million of taxpayer money. They should produce the documents, they should answer questions, and their former Liberal minister shouldn't be across the street right now, ducking, dodging, and diving. He should be answering the questions, being prepared to provide the public with answers.
Good answer. Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Thank you. Well, my honourable colleague spoke about the quite rightly, I think, about the waste of $400 million and how that would be money that would be much better put into our healthcare system. I agree with him. He called on Liberals to apologize for that waste of money. Well, I was in this House when the Conservatives were last in power, when they wasted $2 billion on the Phoenix pay scandal, something that we're still paying for today. So I'm just wondering, would he also, in the spirit of calling for an apology from Liberals for wasting money that could go to healthcare, would he also apologize for the Conservatives wasting $2 billion that also could have and should have gone to healthcare?
Yeah. Yes. Still.
The Honourable Member for Durham.
Madam Speaker, I'm aware that members of the NDP and Liberals see Stephen Harper in their dreams and their nightmares, but I'm actually focused on what's happening today. And what's happening today is that we are pressuring the Liberal government to be accountable to the public for the $400 million corrupt green slush fund. All these efforts to draw us away from that topic and distract us and have us debating things that happened before I was probably even old enough to vote. Sorry, not getting into all that right now. Thank you.
Good answer. Questions and comments. The honourable member for Flamborough-Glenbrook.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I congratulate my friend and colleague from Durham on an excellent speech, and I particularly liked his reference to what's going on across the street in contrast to the many ways which $400 million could be better spent for Canadians. And he broke that down in many important ways and drew many examples. And so I want to ask the member, what is he hearing from his constituents who we know work so hard for the tax dollars that they send here about the fact that this is being wasted in this way and could have been spent on so many better things. And he touched on taxpayer accountability, so maybe you can elaborate a bit more on that. Thank you.
The honourable member for Durham.
Well, thank you for the question to my honourable colleague. Look, I mean, the reality is that the public is aware, the Canadian people are aware that they're being overtaxed. They know that there are expenses that they would like to pay themselves that they cannot afford because the Liberal government is taking too much money out of their pockets and away from their families. And so it's a natural question to ask, what are all the things that I could do if I just had more of the money I work for? And that is the question that Canadians are asking themselves when they look at this $400 million green slush fund. When we look at the things, whether it's hospital stays, car payments, groceries, homes, there's a whole host of things that have become very expensive for a lot of people, things that have become burdens on our public systems, and people are frustrated by what that has done to our quality of life. And as a taxpayer, there is an expectation that when you see that deduction from your paycheck, or that when you see that extra 13% added onto everything that you buy, that you're going to see some benefit from that money being taken away from you. And when that money is being taken and misused, when we have Liberals dishing that money out to Liberal elite insiders like George Costanza and Jerry Seinfeld trading a rye bread out the window, of course you're going to be frustrated. And that is what the Canadian taxpayer feels right now. That is why we're focusing on this issue. We are speaking for the people of our country, and we are speaking for our constituents.
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yeah, Madam Speaker, ironically, the member says ducking and diving. Members should answer questions. I asked him a question, and he didn't even answer the question, Madam Speaker. So let me be a little bit more crystal clear for the member. Foreign interference is a very serious issue in Canada. All political leaders except his leader, the leader of the Conservative Party, has gotten the security clearance. There has been recommendations from legal experts saying that he should be getting the security clearance. We have others that are saying it's absolute nonsense, the rationale the Conservatives are actually using. Will he not or stop ducking and diving and actually answer the question that's been posed to him? Why isn't the leader of the Conservative Party getting the security clearance? Don't give us a bogus answer that doesn't fly, that's already been discredited.
Just reminding the honourable member I won't give any answers. The honourable member for Durham.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So the Liberal member is comparing his former colleague, who was called before committee to answer questions about the Green Slush Fund, refusing to answer questions about the Green Slush Fund, to me commenting on the Green Slush Fund and them doing everything possible to drag me into another conversation. Sorry, I'm not a sucker. I'm not going to stand here and be dragged into any topic under the sun. I stand here to talk about why I'm here, which is to call out the Liberals for mismanaging $400 million of Canadian taxpayer money. That's why we're here. That's what we're debating. He knows better, and I know his tricks. So appreciate the try. Maybe you'll get me next time.
I doubt it. Resuming debate, the honourable member for Edmonton River Bend.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I wish I could think of a Seinfeld reference that is equally as adequate as my esteemed member from Durham there. Hopefully, perhaps as the night goes on, something will come to mind. Before I get into my speech, Madam Speaker, just wanted to highlight something very briefly, if the House will quickly allow. I had the immense privilege to go and visit last weekend an organization called jack.org, and it's Canada's only charity training empowering young leaders to revolutionize mental health. And from the work that they're doing was incredibly moving, and I wish I had more time in the House to share some of those the stories of what they're doing. But suicide among youth is still the leading health-related cause of death for young people in Canada, and 1 in 7 young people in Canada report having suicidal thoughts, to say nothing of those ones who don't report. This year, 150,000 will act on their thoughts by attempting suicide, and for hundreds of them, the attempt will be fatal. Things need to change, and jack.org is doing a lot of that work for us. Thanks, Madam Speaker, for allowing me to do that. Now to the matter at hand, the privilege motion here before the House. And I rise with great disappointment to speak on this question of privilege. This particular question of privilege is related to the failure to produce documents required to produce by an order of this House. On June 10th, a majority of members in this House passed a motion that ordered the production of important documents related to the Sustainable Development Technology Canada. The key word there is order. Not ask, not request, not that, in the opinion of this House, the board should. The word was order. The House of Commons has the authority to order the production of documents, and that authority comes right from the Constitution. Section 18, in fact, of the British North America Act, also known as the Constitution Act 1867, clearly states the privileges, immunities, and powers to be held, enjoyed, and exercised by the Senate and by the House of Commons and by the members thereof respectfully shall be such as are from time to time defined by Act of the Parliament of Canada. That power includes the time-honoured ability to send for persons, papers, and records. As is explained in Bosch and Gagnon in pages 984 and 985, the standing orders do not delimit the power to order the production of papers and records. The result is a broad, absolute power that on the surface appears to be without restriction. There is no limit to the types of papers likely to be requested. The only prerequisite, and state the only prerequisite, is that the papers exist in hard copy or electronic format and that they are located here in Canada. It goes on to read, no statute or practice diminishes the fullness of that power rooted in House privileges unless there is an explicit legal provision to that effect, or unless the House adopts a specific resolution limiting the power. The House has never set a limit on its power to order the production of papers and records. That is our collective right as the House of Commons, as the grand inquest of the nation. Documents have been ordered by this House. Those documents have not been provided to this House. That, unfortunately, is why we're debating the question of privilege today. Sustainable Development Technology Canada, or SDTC for short, or as it has become known here in this House, the Green Slush Fund, has become the organization that we are focusing this privilege motion on once again today. Now, just to back up a bit and for some historical context, the Office of the Auditor General made several key observations during the audit period of March 2017 to December 2023. Here are a few quotes from the report that was tabled in the House on June 4th. 1. 10 projects were approved for $59 million in funding when they should have been deemed ineligible. Personally, Madam Speaker, I'd suggest that's concerning. For 2, STDC's conflict of interest policies were not followed 90 times. Repeat, 90 times, Madam Speaker. Again, also very concerning. 3, the board approved $58 million for projects without ensuring that they met the terms of the contribution agreements. You'd think, Madam Speaker, that this is something the government would also be very concerned about. Meanwhile, their responses to these issues appear to be the exact opposite. In all responses I have seen from the many Auditor General reports, I cannot recall such out-of-touch responses. In their written responses, SDTC made false and outright preposterous claims. 1. SDTC claimed each project proposal goes through rigorous due diligence and evaluation that is robust and highly credible. Simply not true. But if it were true, then they would not be facing this $58 million scandal, unless that due diligence that they were referring to is actually just SDTC insiders looking at who on their board is getting money out of each proposal. 2. SDTC claimed that they were the subject to Innovation, Science and Economic Development evaluation in 2018. That was 6 years ago and outside the Auditor General's audit period. Essentially, SDTC was clearly ignoring the audit period and ignoring these findings. 3. SDTC claimed they use external experts, but then failed to identify them. For an organization whose problem is conflicts of interest, to claim things are going to be better based on the advice provided by some unnamed external experts shows just how out of touch SDTC has really become. 4. SDTC claimed that they did not fully agree to the Auditor General's recommendations because, quote, SDTC has delivered strong outcomes against these objectives. Well, unless those objectives were to push money into companies that board members have a financial interest in, that is simply not true. The Auditor General found 82% of the funding transactions approved by the Board of Directors during the audit period were conflicted. Unreal, Madam Speaker, 82%. Number 5, SDTC wrote written records did not fully capture the robust deliberations that were made, and SDTC is of the view that these projects met the eligibility criteria set out, but acknowledges that the Auditor General reached a different conclusion, suggesting that the independent Auditor General is basically out to get them. The arrogance is appalling, Madam Speaker. The operators of the Green Slush Fund are simply saying the Auditor General got it wrong. Nothing to see here, and we should ignore and let them get back to business. Then, at the same time, they admit that their own written records do not support their claim, so they stick by their story. 6. SDTC claimed they had, quote, clear processes for staff and directors to declare real, potential, and perceived conflicts. Again, this claim completely ignores the findings of the Auditor General and subsequent Public Accounts Committee. We know conflicts were not declared, and even when they were declared, they either voted for their own projects or took turns voting for each other's projects. The idea that there were clear processes for conflicts of interest would be laughable if it just simply weren't so sad, Madam Speaker. 7. SDTC claimed they further strengthened its conflict of interest policies in November 2023. This shows exactly that the SDTC only cared about preventing corruption after they got caught with corruption. By November 2023, they knew the Auditor General's report was coming because the audit period was from March 2017 to December 2023. Claiming that policies have been strengthened and implying nothing further needs to be done after corruption has already been uncovered is simply disingenuous. Madam Speaker, there is a word that comes to mind: entitlement. This kind of entitlement comes from an organization so used to getting vast amounts of money for their own purposes, it disconnects them from the realities of honest and hard-working Canadians. There is still a lot that we don't know about the Green Slush Fund, Madam Speaker, but what we have learned through the Industry Committee and the Public Accounts Committee is alarming. What we have learned so far has made those of us on the opposition benches determined to get the full story. And for that, we need these documents the House requested again back on June 10th. We know that SDTC was created in 2001, and as of an audit in 2017, no problems had arisen. The conflict of interest culture only emerged after board members were appointed under the current Prime Minister by former Minister Baines. The most concerning of these appointments was in 2019, when the chair, Annette Verschun, who was appointed despite multiple warnings of conflict of interest. Those warnings turned out to be warranted, as this past July, the former chair was determined by the Ethics Commissioner to have violated the Conflict of Interest Act for her participation in decisions to benefit organizations she had an interest in. One would suggest they were warned, but went ahead anyway. We now know that former Assistant Deputy Minister Noseworthy was responsible for keeping watch over STDC, but we can only call his job simply a failure. On December 11th of last year, he appeared at the Industry Committee and said, and I quote, "To my knowledge, I am not aware of any decisions to allocate funds to projects related to board members where they did not recuse themselves." Yet, the Auditor General, again, the independent Auditor General, report released just 2 months later informed us that the system was filled with conflicts of interest. He either lied at committee or he was willfully blind to the corruption that was going on around him. We also know that if there was any semblance of good governance, that the Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry would have been notified. But because accountability is absent, we do not know what the minister knew, we do not know what it is that he knew and when he knew it. However, we do know that at least one Liberal MP was informed almost 2 years ago. When the whistleblower known to Public Accounts Committee as Witness 1 appeared at Public Accounts last month, they informed the committee that they had informed the Liberal member for Calgary Skyview all the way back in May of 2022. The whistleblower further stated that this member, and I quote, "assured me that he took this situation seriously and guaranteed that he would facilitate contact with the appropriate people in the federal government and the Auditor General's office." However, we now know that this member was not true to his word and subsequently refused to engage. We know that the directors were appointed to the board. A key example of this was longtime Liberal operative Stephen Kuchar. He was appointed to the board in February 2021. This is after he had been a long-time donor, a ministerial staffer in the Chrétien government, a regional organizer for the Liberal Party, and former General Secretary for the Liberal Party 2016 convention. Shortly after the Prime Minister came into office, this insider became a lobbyist, where he advocated for energy and transportation businesses. It doesn't get more inside than this, Madam Speaker. Yet, he was appointed to the board of the Green Slush Fund, exactly where companies that had a financial interest in could receive contributions directly from the government. Furthermore, in another twist, as my honourable colleague from South Shore St. Margaret's has explained, we now know that the Minister of Environment has had an interest in a venture capital firm called Cycle Capital. This same Cycle Capital also received funding from the same Green Slush Fund. It just keeps unraveling more and more. Finally, Madam Speaker, we now know from a member of the new board that since this scandal broke, none of the money that was wrongfully sent out has been recovered. This is unfair, unacceptable, and quite frankly, incredibly frustrating on behalf of the Canadian taxpayer. Simply put, after all this, it seems rather clear and painfully obvious that we need the documents that were called for in the motion passed by a clear majority of members on June 10th. This is not only a matter of parliamentary privilege, it is a moral obligation to Canadians. In order to meet that obligation, we need to access documents when we have ordered them from the executive branch. Public Accounts Committee are still waiting on documents they have requested to receive. We do not have the contribution and funding agreement showing the requirements and obligations of the recipients. We do not have the conflict of interest declarations of the board members, and we owe it to Canadians to produce this information. When we put all this together, we do not have transparency, we do not have oversight, and we do not have accountability. Madam Speaker, I started my speech indicating that I am disappointed to be rising on this debate here in Parliament, because it's not the first time we've seen this type of parliamentary privilege be violated. Earlier this year, on yet another privilege debate, on yet another scandal, the one related to ArriveCan scandal, the slow erosion of rights and privileges is not a small matter, it is an absolute threat to our democracy. We saw this in the previous Parliament with the Winnipeg Lab scandal, and it caused tremendous hardship for the scandal-plagued government. On that occasion, in the 43rd Parliament, the President of the Public Health Agency of Canada was even called to the bar of this House of Commons to be admonished for failing, or perhaps more accurately, refusing to provide documents that he has been ordered to provide to this House. One would have hoped that the government would have learned from that experience, but clearly they have not, and here we are again. In June 2021, 140 members of that side of the House shamefully voted against that motion on question of privilege, which has proved, I would think, to be a huge mistake. I should hope this time around history does not repeat itself, and they do not repeat that mistake. And now we have this green slush fund scandal. This government continues to refuse to release documents that it has been ordered to produce because one can only presume they do not want to help uncover corruption that has occurred under their watch for the past several years. Corruption that has benefited their own insiders is an issue of vital importance. No matter how hard the government tries to push it away, Parliament must continue to pursue it. Madam Speaker, when the Opposition House Leader made the initial question of privilege, he referenced a memorandum he had obtained from the Privy Council office at the beginning of this Parliament. That memorandum reads, "Public servants do not share in ministers' constitutional accountability to the Houses of Parliament, but support ministers in this accountability. The ultimate accountability for deciding what information to withhold from or release to parliamentarians resides with the responsible minister. This government may believe the rights and privileges of Parliament no longer matter, but we will soon see if they believe the ministerial responsibility still matters. It is the Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry who is ultimately responsible for STDC and for this violation of an order of the House. It is the Minister who must be held accountable." Now, in conclusion, Madam Speaker, I support the motion as moved by the Opposition House Leader, and I'll reference it here. The member from Regina Coppell to alleged failure to produce documents pertaining to Sustainable Development Technology Canada. The House resumed consideration of the motion that the government's failure providing documents as ordered by the House on June 10, 2024 be hereby referred to the Standing Committee of Procedure and House Affairs. And then of the amendment, they provided that this instruction to the committee that the following witnesses be ordered to appear before the committee separately for 2 hours each: the Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry, the Clerk of the Privy Council, the Auditor General of Canada, the Commissioner of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the Deputy Minister of Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada, the Law Clerk and Parliamentary Counsel of the House of Commons, the Acting President of Sustainable Development Technology Canada, a panel consisting of Board of Sustainable Development Technology Canada, and that it report back to the House no later than November 22, 2024. The Green Slush Fund has been exposed as a tremendous waste, a scandal where taxpayers' hard-earned money was used to benefit government insiders at STDC. We need more details, Madam Speaker. Canadians deserve to know more details. Canadians deserve to know who's at fault. There are individuals who need to be held accountable, and the people within the government who should have known and should have prevented this from happening need to be held accountable. I will be voting for this motion, and at this time, I hope every member, regardless of party affiliation, does the right thing and votes yes. Yes for accountability, yes for respecting orders of the House of Commons. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. That's just it. You know, let's have the vote. That's what the member just read is the motion. It is a Conservative motion, but it is the Conservative Party that is preventing the vote from occurring. It's going to pass. Allow for the vote. Allow us to give you what it is that you want for it to go to committee. That's the issue. That aside, another issue that I've raised on numerous occasions yet no one in the Conservative Party has been able to provide an explanation to Canadians. And Canadians do have a right to know. Why will a leader of the Conservative Party of Canada not get the security clearance? Is there something in the background of the leader? Is there something that the leader of the Conservative Party is scared to tell Canadians about his past? Is it because the leadership convention that he won was influenced by foreign international interference? Is it because there's members of his caucus that are affiliated with it? What is it? Why is the Conservative leader so scared? I believe he's told his caucus, and his caucus is so scared also. What are they hiding? Why won't they even answer the question? Madam Speaker, I believe Canadians are owed the truth.
The honourable member for Edmonton Riverbend.
Point of order, Madam Speaker. Can I
OK, so 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Combien est-ce qu'on a en ligne? 15. Est-ce qu'on a... Voilà. Est-ce qu'on a 5 en ligne? 3. OK, that makes 16. 19. We have one missing. Squad. OK. So, yeah. Okay, we are suspended until the call of the chair. The honourable member for Edmonton Riverbend.
I'd ask him to repeat the question, Madam Speaker, but but honestly, it's the same question he's asked to every single member that's here.
The honourable parliamentary secretary on a point of order.
There was a bit of time lapse there. I'd be more than happy to repeat the question if the member is serious.
The member has clarified that. The honourable member for Edmonton Riverbend.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I do like the member from Winnipeg North who teased, but yeah, we like each other. There you go. It's getting late. It must be something. The Halloween's the spirits in the mood. Yeah, Madam Speaker, the question that he likes to throw back at us is about security clearance, which one could argue relevance here in this particular debate, but we just saw in this question period earlier today, we saw our leaders stand up over and over again, offering policy ideas, offering solutions for Canadians, and everything we heard back from members on the other side, including the member from Winnipeg North, the Prime Minister, is rambling on about the security clearance, which the Leader of the Opposition has been clear over and over again as to the type of government that these guys seem to be running over there, that we can't wait until we form government, and then there'll be, the names will be opened up. What we're trying to get to here is these documents, and for him to say that simply he wants to have a debate about the foreign interference again, I would say it's something to be of relevance on this particular debate, but we'll I guess allow the lenience as seeing the only member that's asking questions over there, that at the end of the day we're simply asking for these documents, and I would encourage the member to encourage his team and his cabinet to produce these documents.
L'honorable député de Lac-Saint-Jean.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Merci beaucoup. Je veux remercier le collègue pour ce discours. C'est dommage parce que je pense que ce n'est pas tout le monde qui va mettre son oreillette et comprendre ce que j'ai à dire aujourd'hui, mais je veux vraiment le féliciter parce que ça fait presque...
Le député, il semble que l'interprète...
Oh, the interpreter apologizes. The microphone was not on. Is the interpretation available now? Starting over from the beginning, the honourable member. Well, I will then repeat that I've been listening to my colleague's speech closely. And honestly, Madam Speaker, we've been here for nearly a month, and I actually think this is the very best speech that we have heard on this question of privilege. I listened closely and I said to myself, wow, we have not heard a better speech than this one. I want to congratulate him because it was out of the ordinary, it was out of the box, it was remarkable. And it leads me to think that there is still more to say on this matter. Now, my question is simple. If the Liberals were to hand over the documents which would put an end to this question of privilege, what we've heard is that the Conservatives have already prepared another question of privilege. So my question, their leader keeps saying all over the place that all he wants is an election. And yet, what he's planning is that if we finally put an end to this question of privilege, he just wants to do another one. So I'm really wondering, and I hope my colleague will answer, is this really true? Are we going to come back to yet another question of privilege?
River Bend.
Thanks, Madam Speaker. I think I should take him on the road with me. That's great. Saying that my speech was the best one he heard. I think that might go over really well in Alberta, having a member of the Bloc Québécois come in and share that out there. So come on out to Alberta. If the impression in this House is that we're the ones coming up with points of privilege, then I think that's kind of what perhaps is maybe the mistake here. These are points of privilege granted by you, Madam Speaker, the Speaker, and they're the ones who we go and we raise these points of privilege, and whether or not they're granted are solely determined by the Speaker. So if there are more points of privilege coming, then I would. One that's on you, Madam Speaker, but also on this government. So I guess can stay tuned, and I'll start preparing my speech now if there's another one. And I hope he's in the chamber to help be part of it.
Questions and comments, the Honourable Member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Thank you. Well, my honourable colleague gave a serious speech. I think it deserves a serious question. I agree fully that this entire spectacle is a disgrace. I mean, we have contracts being given, money being misspent, taxpayers do deserve answers, and documents, I agree, do need to be disclosed. My serious question is this. From what I understand is that the Speaker's ruling says that the documents must be disclosed to PROC. And it appears to me that that is exactly what my honourable colleague's party wants. Can he explain to this House why that's not enough? Why can't we proceed to a vote, have those documents sent to PROC, and we can actually get the answers that his party seeks? What is wrong with that?
The Honourable Member for Edmonton River Bend.
Thanks, Madam Speaker. It's great to see my honourable colleague in the House. Him and I had a lot of days during COVID on Zoom calls together. And that reminds me of the Winnipeg lab scandal that we went through and we saw together. At the end of the day, a lot of that was about transparency and accountability and making sure that we had somebody who was accountable for that. And ultimately, we did, and we brought someone to the House. And I think a lot of the work from that particular committee did a lot of that good work. I would suggest that it seems like almost every day there's something new that's unfolding with this scandal. We've had the honourable member from South Shore St. Margaret's who's constantly finding new information. There's new board members saying that things haven't been repaid. It's the accountability and transparency, quite frankly, is a moving target. It feels like for this particular government. So until we get to the bottom of that, it's going to be something that hopefully this government hears seriously as we have been debating this for a while in the House and finally produces these documents.
The Honourable Member for Surrey Newton, a very brief question.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. As by now most of the members are well familiar that Canadian was killed or assassinated on a Canadian soil in my constituency. And my constituents are asking me to ask every Conservative the question why their leader is not taking a security clearance to protect Canadians, and in fact some of his own members that might be under the...
Very, very brief answer from the Honourable Member for Edmonton River Bend. No answer. Orders of the day.
Orders of the day, ordre du jour, adoption de rapport de comité.
Resuming debate on the motion to concur in the 6th report of the Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy and Ethics, facial recognition technology, and the growing power of artificial intelligence.
The resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Selkirk Interlake Eastman.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. And indeed, a privilege to be able to rise again to speak in this House. And I should just note that at the beginning, I'll be splitting my time with the great member from the Bay of Quinte. Now, a couple of years ago, when I was on the Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy and Ethics, we tabled this great report on facial recognition technology and the growing power of artificial intelligence. And the concurrence motion on this was brought forward a couple weeks ago by my colleague from Calgary, Nose Hill, and she very well articulated why we needed to do the study in the first place, because of the problems that we have in Canada with the unregulated use of facial recognition technology and how artificial intelligence has been.
Can I interrupt the Honourable Member? Can we check that the courtyards are a little quieter, please? Thank you. The Honourable Member for Selkirk Interlake Eastman.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And from the top? No. Being rudely interrupted. But anyway, you know, we have a situation where policy has lagged behind. Technology is moving at lightning speed. And the government's answer to this is Bill C-27, which is a broken piece of legislation that's already been admitted to by the Ministry of Industry. And the minister has said that we need to improve upon it through amendments at committee. But when it's this broken in three parts, it really makes it more difficult to modify and manage something that is happening, and we need to go back to the drawing board. Now, I just want to point out some of the problems that we studied at committee. We heard about how Tim Hortons, for example, their app was actually tracking the movement of customers who were using the Tim Hortons app to buy their food, and then tracking their movements for the first 10 minutes after they left a Tim Hortons store, and then sold that information to other stores so that they could harvest that data and then determine how best to access those customers. A complete violation of privacy, but kind of a you know, an ingenious way of making use of an app and GPS and using that technology to be able to track people. So if Tim Hortons could do that, imagine what other nefarious actors could do here in Canada or around the world. We also heard from a security perspective how the RCMP and other police agencies across this country made use of facial recognition technology that came out of the Clearview AI database. Now, the disturbing part of Clearview AI is that they went and scraped all their images to train their artificial intelligence from social media. So they're accessing Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and using all of that information and plugging it in. And then when they programmed it, whether they did it knowingly or unknowingly, created a racial algorithm that was biased, especially to those that were men of darker complexions, you know, whether they're Middle Eastern, whether they're African, so black, brown, was definitely discriminated against in the technology, and were wrongfully accusing through facial recognition that was being used in mass by the RCMP and other police agencies here in Canada, as well as in the United States, and causing this discrimination in arrests that were ultimately wrong at the end of the day. The same was happening with our Indigenous Canadians, who were also being wrongfully accused through the use of Clearview AI technology by the RCMP. We also had TELUS that were providing data and giving locations of people for tracking for things like COVID to the Public Health Agency of Canada. Again, a complete violation of the privacy rights of Canadians. And then we can't forget how We had, of course, the trucker convoy up here, but we had the public doxing of those that were part of the trucker convoy, that they were located by using GPS, and then someone was able to go into the system and map them out on Google Maps and publicly disclose their banking information as well as their home addresses. Complete violation of Canadian privacy. And so we dug in on this when we were part of the Committee on Ethics and Privacy and Protection of Information. Now, Madam Speaker, we want to make sure that individuals are aware of it. Public education needs to keep up. And at the end of the day, Madam Speaker, we need to make sure that there is the right to know that you're being your data has been collected either through facial recognition with all the cameras that we have around here on the Hill, never mind what's happening in other public spaces like airports and train stations, in stores, and there needs to be a public disclosure of that so people know when they're entering that there's proper signage, and we get into all of this in the recommendations. But also, people have the right to have that information disposed of, including images that may be left up on social media platforms, including images that have been collected by government agencies and corporations, because also employees are also exposed to this at work because there's cameras all over the place monitoring, that when they leave that platform or they leave that employment or they are no longer